Good morning, everyone. Thanks for showing up bright and early. I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Sanjot Mehendale, and as the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, I would like to welcome you to our annual Tang conference in Silk Road Studies. Some of you may remember that we had scheduled this conference in the spring, right at the end of a series of talks on the networks of trade and exchange that crisscross the grasslands of Central Eurasia, and which highlighted how those networks formed an integral part of what we now refer to as the Silk Roads. After a number of setbacks and delays, I'm very happy that many of the original participants were able to join us today virtually to put a fitting end to what before COVID had been a very exciting annual program. So today's conference is really designed to highlight recent research and also to be a conversation among some of the leading scholars on the Eurasian steppe region. Now, before I introduce the chair discussants, let me say a few things about the format. As you know, there'll be two panels today, 9 to 11, and then 12 to 2 with a break in the middle. Now, given that this is a webinar, the audience is not visible to the speakers. So if you have a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A button to type it in. We'll try and accommodate as many questions as possible. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, on the other hand, please use the chat button, and that will be monitored by our host, and we'll try to fix any problems you may be experiencing. All right, so the moderators of our two panels today are James Langton and Andrew Womack. I'm just waiting for them to pop up. There they are. So Andrew Womack, who will be the chair of the second panel. Now, Andrew is an anthropological archaeologist in the departments of Asian Studies and Anthropology at Furman University. As associate director of the Tao River Archaeological Project, an international collaboration between Chinese and North American institutions, he coordinates research on the intersection of technological, social, and climatic change at the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age sites in northwestern China. Now, this morning's chair is James Langton. He's an archaeologist specialized in analysis and interpretation of ancient glass and its distribution along Eurasian trading networks. Now, James is an honorary senior research associate at University College London and its sister institution in Qatar. He is also, and lucky for us, been a visiting scholar at the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. Now I'll leave it up to the chairs of each panel, Andrew and James respectively, to introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. So I will now pass the baton to James Langton.
Thank you very much, Sanjot, for the introduction and the opportunity to participate in this webinar. We have a very exciting panel this morning with three panelists. The first will be Dr. Katie McFarland, who is the manager of the Archaeological Repository Collections at the Arizona State Museum, and has more than 15 years of experience handling this large and busy state-operated archaeological repository. She was awarded her PhD from the School of Anthropology, University of Arizona in 2017, and her research investigates the continental scale patterning of religious symbolism and the articulation of these patterns to religious landscapes in North Central Eurasia in the first millennium BCE. The second speaker will be Dr. Yukio Kasai, who received her doctorate from the Free University of Berlin in 2005. Yukio is active on the research staff and later research coordinator of the Academy Project on Turfan Studies at the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Science and Humanities. And since 2018, she's worked on the research staff of the ERC project, The Buddhist Road, at the Ruhr University in Bochum. Her research topic is Old Uyghur philology, and she especially focuses on Old Uyghur Buddhist texts excavated from the Turfan area. Our third speaker this morning will be Dr. Brian Miller, who's a faculty member at the History of Art Department at the University of Michigan and an affiliate with the Museum of Anthropological Anthropology at Michigan. Following his PhD in East Asian civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania, he's focused his research on the dynamics of empires in early East Asia, incorporating textual analysis and material culture studies. He's led archaeological survey and excavation projects in various regions of Mongolia. And his current book will be on the Xiongnu Steppe Empire, integrating translations of Chinese documents with analyses of archaeological remains from China, Mongolia, and Central Asia. And we're all looking forward to that. So let's go ahead and start right away with Dr. McFarland. Katie, thank you very much for doing your presentation.
Hello, everybody. Let me get my... All right. Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here discussing my research with you today. In this talk, I'm going to engage you in a broadly conceived discussion of the material culture of North Central Eurasia. The artifacts and concepts I'm going to cover encompass the entire region and are attributed to the first millennium BCE. My research approach is currently at what I refer to as the macro or continental scale. I've been thinking through ways to identify big scale patterns among broadly conceived regions that are determined by geography, archaeological patterns, modern political divisions, knowing that when I am able to turn to finer resolution studies, I will find greater variation than we can hope to see in a study of this resolution and will fill in a much richer tapestry of cultural adaptation and social complexity. Now, let's dive into the artifacts. Exotic and expertly manufactured gold objects from tombs of ancient horsemen in the Altai Mountains first captured the attention of Tsar Peter the Great in 1715. Peter the Great saw value in these objects. Decorated with dynamic depictions of animals, and issued an imperial edict calling for the preservation and collection of more such objects from Siberia, which constitutes a very early form of law protecting antiquities. The artifacts depicted here, most of which are from the Peter the Great collection, are cited as naturalistic depictions of North Black Sea Scythians wearing pointed hats, holding weapons and or interacting with animals, and are cited as evidence for a pastoral nomad lifestyle. The composite animals depicted on this set of materials, frequently in combat interactions, are considered a direct link between material culture of the North Black Sea and that of the Urals and Altai regions. Study of these objects and those like it are the foundation upon which identification of the Scythian cultural phenomenon has been built for centuries. Material culture, both undecorated and decorated, with animal, human, and geometric images, are the subject of today's discussion. Both art historians and archaeologists have attempted to identify patterns in North Central Eurasian symbols, specifically ASA, by developing typologies. These studies focus on the similarity or difference of specific attributes, either looking for generalized similarities, composite animals, overall way figures are depicted, resulting in diffusionist explanations that mask difference, or detail-oriented analyses that highlight differences in types. The emphasis of similarity or difference usually depends on the motivating research question. The methodology taken in my research moves beyond traditional approaches by empirically identifying similarities and differences in figural depictions between regions on the elemental level. This method focuses on identifying and analyzing the components that make up the overall decoration, resulting in an analysis that is sensitive to both similarity and dissimilarity in artifact decorations and figural depictions. Historic and ethnographic sources can provide some insights in the ways that North Central Eurasians utilize landscape and the material signatures of these practices. Used with caution, these sources can serve as robust information for inductive phases of research. My approach has been to attempt to derive some general testable inferences that can inform empirically driven studies. Today, I'm interested in two inferences, briefly described, that can be directly tied to the statistical analyses I will discuss in this presentation. The first comes from comments made by both Herodotus and Aristotle regarding the relationship of griffins and gold. And the inference I derive from this is composite animals were associated with highly ritualized locations and materials. The second comes from Herodotus again, who described long-distance burial journeys of elites in the Middle Iron Age. He is joined by Owen Lattimore, who described the burial journeys of Genghis Khan, both the original as related to him from stories of the 13th century CE, and the annual journeys and rituals he witnessed in the 1930s that seemed to reinforce political alliances and other relationships between various groups of people, all paying tribute to this leader. Regardless of whether or not the body of Genghis Khan was buried somewhere in ethnic Mongolia or was on a constant journey as witnessed by Lattimore, it appears that the general inference, long-distance burial journeys of leaders, is a long-standing tradition and is a reasonable conclusion to reach. Generally, these inferences contribute religious explanations for material culture attributes and mobility, prompting our next discussion. The concept of religion that underlies my entire discussion comes from practice theory and materiality in a similar vein to Vogelin's and Bradley's work. Both of these concepts focus on the ways that people actively create, modify, and maintain ritual practices and religious principles through creative actions in both the human and material realms. The goal is to identify the material indicators of actions that are attributable to ritual and religious belief. Since we are focused on imagery and their role in cultural practices, the actionable and empirically testable definition of religion guiding this research comes from Geertz, in which religion is a structured system of beliefs and symbols that permeate the everyday life of those interacting within that structure. Symbols are an obvious way that people display ideas indicative of religious belief. I think that ASA is one such example. Illustrated here are a series of images that relate to a particular set of recurring themes that is different from the typical Griffin composite. Each of these images contains a stylized composite figure composed of an ungulate, usually a cervid, horse, or combination, feline, raptorial bird, and Galliformes bird. Among these images, a predator/non-predator relationship is expressed in one or multiple ways. One, the composite figures are a fusion of predators and non-predators. Two, predator figures are attacking non-predators. And three, predator figures are attacking another composite figure. The repetition of these similar themes occurs in four or five geographic study regions. The similar depiction of animals in multiple media are a good example of symbols permeating the everyday life of individuals interacting within a religious structure. Despite, however, the similar nature and content of these images, among the regions, there is still obvious variation or difference in the way they are combined and the ways the figures interact. The structured nature of religion should be tempered with consideration of agency and materiality. People are constantly interacting with and deciding to create things that are in line or not with beliefs and ideas they may share or at least influence them. This means that despite the similarity of the content and graphical representation of the animals depicted in each artifact and tattoo depicted here, we should expect that meanings and context will vary across space and through time. A concept summarizes ritualization. In this research, the direct connection between religion, ritualization, and materiality are symbols. One of the interesting things about symbols is that one image does not need to be an exact replica of another depiction to be a recognizable expression of similar ideas. The elements of the graphical composition are the core issue. The presence or absence of components necessary to convey a particular idea is the role that the symbol as a whole plays in signaling membership in a community that would be recognizable to those who knew how to interpret what they were seeing. There are many types of images in the study area that can be labeled as symbols related to religious beliefs and local expression of those beliefs, which, when articulated with conceptions of cultural landscapes, as described by Humphrey and Jordan in conceptual metaphors, widen the interpretive possibilities for the material patterns that emerge. Concepts of mobility are crucial to tying all the information I've presented so far together. This next statement may end up being the biggest understatement of this entire conference, but I'll say it anyway. Mobility in North Central Eurasia was complex. The term itself applies to a broad range of movements and behaviors defined as the capacity and need for movement from place, which focuses on the movement of humans in the landscape, but leaves their organization and motivations to be determined. There are a wide variety of approaches and methods that have been utilized to study mobility and the implications for this mobility. Each of these lines of evidence contributes an important piece to a larger goal of identifying and attempting to understand and explain mobility in this region and period. We know there were a lot of people and animals who were mobile in North Central Eurasia throughout the first millennium BCE. There isn't enough time to go into specifics in my talk, other than to situate the research I'm describing in this paradigm. I am focused on evidence we can gather from artifact attributes and specifically engage with the question, could there have been religious motivations for mobility? It is clear that wide-ranging political alliances and a unique political structure developed throughout the first millennium BCE was rooted in access to horses and the ability to travel long distances. What remains unclear to me, and one of the driving questions I have been considering in this research, is whether or not religious beliefs were a motivating factor in short and long distance travel. I have to wonder if political and economic motivations for mobility are enough to explain the widespread patterns we see with ASA in the study area and period. Historical and ethnographic data are a reminder that religious beliefs can prompt many reasons to be mobile, traveling to pay homage to specific meaningful places, burial journeys, and reasons tied to materiality. We will now turn to evidence we can discern from material culture. I have cast a wide net and included all material I could find a picture of and linked to provenience data or analyzed in person that is related or associated with the Scythian, Saka, Sarmatian, Sauromatian, Xiongnu, etc. cultural dynamic. This approach results in a study area that ranges from Southeast Europe to Transbaikalia in the first millennium BCE, which I have broken down into analysis units of early, middle, and late Iron Age. I applied the same coding scheme to all objects and tried to capture as much of the style into discrete categories as I could that are both descriptive and content-driven analysis units, which I call decorative attributes, to identify where there is similarity and difference. Data were derived from analysis of artifacts housed at the UPenn Museum of Archaeology, photos taken of artifacts displayed in museum exhibits such as the State Hermitage Museum and Metropolitan Museum of Art, or published in catalogs and site reports. The entire data set is composed of 4,633 catalog lots, a single object or set, from multiple provenience confidence levels. All data are held in a relational database, which was specifically designed to catalog each object or catalog lot, recording provenience information, materials, and technology used to create the object and decorative attributes. The analysis of this data set begins with some basic housekeeping assessment. This graph illustrates the distribution of catalog lots for each period. Dates assigned to each catalog, artifact catalog lots are based on stylistic analysis for the vast majority of the data set. As you can see, there are gaps in regions and time periods, which I will fill in future research. However, I think we have a moderately good spread by region and period. Since most of the artifacts are from museum exhibits and collections, it is reasonable to assume the sample is biased toward decorated artifacts. This is a concern because it is important to strive for a data set that covers as much of the behavioral spectrum as possible, including objects that are used every day, in addition to those that may be appropriate for special occasions. There are more decorated than undecorated catalog lots in the data set. However, a substantial portion of the catalog lots assigned to each time and period are undecorated, limiting the bias toward decorated artifacts, which means that it's possible to gain a sense of how restrictive the usage of ASA may have been within the parameters of this data set. In order to better contextualize the results of the study, I think it is necessary to statistically assess a different kind of bias, the evenness of the data set. For this, the data set was evaluated with Simpson's Diversity Index to assess the diversity of the object types included in this analysis and associated proveniences. The statistic results in a diversity score. The more evenly distributed an object type is across the data set, the larger the value of this index. The graph depicts a diversity score, the diversity scores of object types by region. 6 out of 10 regions have a diversity score above 4, taken as an indication that the data set is at least moderately diverse in most regions. The next graph is by object context from a known region. The results indicate this data set has diverse representation of objects that were recovered from burial contexts, specifically kurgans, across most regions than other types of provenience. This graph illustrates overall bias in the data set, and it should be obvious that the statistics we will now turn to will be a nuanced discussion of ASA as it occurs in mostly burial contexts. This also highlights the necessity to consider the variety of influences that may impact the presence of material culture present in this data set. We will now turn to analysis of the decorative attributes recorded from artifacts in the data set. We will begin with the coding system itself and turn to statistical analyses of these data. My analysis approach breaks down aspects of the decorations depicted on artifacts and the forms of the artifacts themselves. The coding system is focused on recording 7 categories of decorative attributes that attempt to capture as much of the style as possible. This slide shows an artifact from the data set and the way it is coded into the database. Each decorative attribute is recorded for presence absence into this database and exported for statistical analysis to assess similarity and dissimilarity with other artifacts in the dataset based on these attributes. There's no decoration. If there is no decoration on an artifact, then this record will include the code undecorated in each table. The Rupp-Crick index of similarity is a distance matrix statistic that compares the occurrences of decorative attributes common to two regions, comparing this apparent similarity with a random distribution, in this case a Monte Carlo simulation, assessing the significance of the result. This test is used on presence-absence data. The index itself works under a null hypothesis that there is a random sprinkling of data points in a given data set. The higher the number, the more likely it is that we can reject the null hypothesis, meaning that the distribution is not random. The score also gives us a sense of the strength of the similarity and dissimilarity in pairwise comparisons. I ran this test on each decorative attribute category and pairwise comparisons among all regions. I've mapped the similarity scores for all pairwise comparisons and decorative attributes. For this presentation, I will focus on 4 decorative attributes: decoration, decorative combination, context, and interaction. The lines on these graphs or maps are graphical illustration of the strength of the score. Red is more similar, blue is less similar. So let's start with decoration. In the early Iron Age, we see similarity scores ranging from over 90% to 32.7. In the middle and late Iron Ages, we see a great deal more similarity. Overall, there appears to be higher degrees of similarity when this decorative category is the focus. Okay, decorative combination. We start to see more differentiation in the pairwise comparisons. We consider the combinations of figures and decorations that are recorded in the early, middle, and late Iron Age periods. However, higher degrees of similarity emerge in the middle Iron Age, receding again in the late Iron Age, if you look at the percentages there. Decorative context. We see a similar pattern when looking at the results of decorative context in the figures and decorations appear in pairwise comparisons, middle and late, and then decorative interaction. I think this pattern basically persists. In this research, a high degree of similarity in graphical representations are interpreted as an indication of shared cultural dynamics, specifically common expression of beliefs and ideas that serve as a visible link between communities. The results I have shared illustrate that there are some aspects of the decorations that appear to be highly similar decoration, as well as aspects that appear to show how each region adapts ASA to their own purpose. Similarity is interpreted as a likely sign that there is a structure so that people were using ASA. Difference can be interpreted in a few ways. It can be a sign of ritualization or local flavor and expression. It can be an indication of an area where there is more differentiation and more work to be done. It could also mean that the attribute and variable may not be relevant in a particular region or at all. The next statistical test we will discuss, Permanova, further helps differentiate among decorative attributes that are similarly and differently expressing images associated with ASA and test independent variables that may account for the patterns we have observed so far. I have selected the same 4 decorative attributes for the Permanova test that showed the most similarity in the Rupp-Crick distance matrix results. Permanova is a hypothesis testing statistical method that can be used on non-parametric data. It is a technique used to check if the means of 2 or more groups are significantly different from each other. It can work with any measure of dissimilarity or distance matrix and can be used on presence-absence data. For consistency, the Rupp-Crick distance matrix was used for this statistic. In this analysis, the pseudo-F ratio is constructed to compare the distances among observations in the same group versus those in different groups. Then the method uses permutations again the Monte Carlo approach, of the observations to obtain a probability of significance assessment. The results are interpreted by analyzing the pseudo-F statistic and p-values. The higher the pseudo-F statistic, the more likely it is that the null hypothesis of no difference among group means is false and can be rejected. This analysis is a series of one-way Permanova tests focused on 5 independent variables: region, site type, site object context, object type, and metal type, and the 4 groups of decorative attributes I've already mentioned. The tests are run on datasets grouped by period. So I'm not expecting you to really look at this too closely, other than to notice that the results are statistically significant for the early, middle, and late Iron Age periods. In order to discuss the results in this presentation, I have restructured the tables, grouping the periods by decorative attribute, rank ordering the test groups by pseudo F. I will limit my discussion of these results with some general observations. So we'll start with similarity. Within each period, there are statistically significant differences between the groups. However, inspection of the pseudo F values for each comparison showed degrees of difference. The results of the early Iron Age indicate that the occurrence of each type of decorative attribute is least dissimilar when considering site type as the independent variable. For both middle and late Iron Ages, the occurrence of each assemblage of decorative attributes are least dissimilar when considering object type as the independent variable. There is one exception to this for the decorative attribute during the late Iron Age. There appears to be more similarity within the decorations in these assemblages when considering site object context, but it is then followed by object type. For each decorative attribute group, most pseudo F values are on the low end. I'm somewhat arbitrarily considering results below 20 is on the low end. Now, differences. Generally, there doesn't appear to be much of a consistent pattern regarding which independent variables are least dissimilar for each decorative attribute group for the early and late Iron Ages. The middle Iron Age, however, appears to be show more consistency in this regard. This may be an indication of more structured rules in which decorative attributes appear on artifacts. If we were to put the independent variables on a continuum of dissimilarity in the middle Iron Age, the decorative attributes would be least dissimilar on object types, followed by metal type, then region, with site type or site object context following as most dissimilar. One of the variables I am most interested in is metal as it relates to inference 1. I've suspected that the animals and subject matter depicted on gold artifacts or artifacts where gold is present may be different from other metal types. The results indicate that the metal type variable shows moderate dissimilarity in all periods for the decoration, decorative combination, and context groups. However, when focusing on decorative interaction, we see sharp divergence in the early and late Iron Age periods. If you're interested, I can later discuss the underlying data that indicates there may be differentiation between metal types and decorative attribute categories. Focus on the Rapp-Crick index of similarity illustrates the overall degree of similarity and dissimilarity for the decorative attributes. Big picture patterns emerge when they're assessing the data in this way. However, other than knowing that the decorations themselves that are depicted on artifacts are similar, we don't really have an idea of what might be driving similarity in ASA expression from these results. This is the reason for the Permanova tests. From these tests, we learned that in the early Iron Age, there is the least amount of dissimilarity in the 4 selected decorative attributes when site types are considered. In the middle and late Iron Ages, there we can see the least amount of dissimilarity when object types are considered. These results alone are a lot to unpack and provide avenues of future study. It is likely that there were complex and dynamic economic, political, and religious relationships that linked communities in various ways throughout the region, the relationships changing through time. This topic is so complex that I can only highlight a few issues that are directly relevant to this presentation. I think that the interregional similarity shown here is a preliminary indication of religious landscapes, composed of regions in which symbolic usage reminiscent of the way religion is defined for these purposes is similar enough that people from communities within the regions would recognize what they saw. The adherence to at least some rules when depicting ASA adds strength to this inference. Religious reasons for mobility, such as long-distance burial journeys mentioned in inference 2, could be one mechanism for spreading knowledge of ASA and signaling participation in religious, political, and economic relationships. Strong similarity in the way symbols are expressed does not necessarily imply economic or political relationships. However, identification of relationships between regions that at least have a strong religious basis based on their expression of ASA are an effective limiting factor in the preliminary identification of the regions participating in at least one avenue of this Iron Age North Central Eurasian cultural dynamic. I believe these results offer indications of how mutually intelligible belief systems supported wide-ranging complex networks of social interaction that contributed to the emergence of the later formalized Silk Road, continental trade networks, religious and political alliances. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Katie, for that presentation. This, as you say, it's a lot to unpack, and we'll enjoy having the opportunity to do that later during the discussion and the question period. The next speaker will be Dr. Yukio Kasai. with her presentation. So Yukio, go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much for invitation to this very interesting conference, and good evening from Germany. So it's my pleasure that I could talk about my research in this circle. So the Uyghurs, a Turkic-speaking nomadic tribe, came into the historical spotlight with the establishment of their empire, the East Uyghur Khaganate in Mongolia in the middle of the 8th century. After the demise of this Khaganate, their major part moved into the eastern part of Tinshan area and founded their new kingdom there, West Uyghur Kingdom. This kingdom continuously existed even after the rise of Genghis Khan, whom the Uyghur king at the time voluntarily submitted. Through this long period, the Uyghurs experienced many cultural, religious, and political exchanges with various non-Turkic speaking groups surrounding them that gradually changed significant part of the Uyghur society. The migration from Mongolia into the Central Asian oasis, moreover, served as the impetus for the nomadic Uyghurs becoming sedentary. This fundamental shift in their life way dramatically impacted the Uyghurs, and in the West Uyghur Kingdom, the new suitable social system had to be established. Then, after the establishment of the Mongol Empire, the know-how which the Uyghurs developed for the management of their ruling system was effectively inserted in the Mongolian rule. So you can see here the connected area. So Uyghurs were at first in Mongolia in the steppe area, and they moved into the oasis area. Among various changes, the religious shift is, besides that of lifestyle, one of the most significant changes for the Uyghurs. Because of their contact with various religious groups, not only one religion, but also some religions made an impact on the Uyghur society. Especially the relationship between those religions and the ruler's legitimation is relevant because in it, the society's perception of the moment should be reflected. And the source of the ruling power is often closely connected with the religions. This talk, therefore, focuses on this relationship and discusses the continuity of the Uyghurs' nomadic tradition and various changes through the dramatical shift of their lifeway between 8th to 13th century. How the Uyghur rulers defined the source of their power and legitimatized their rule is difficult to know. One of the reasons for this difficulty is the shortage of sources written by the Uyghurs in their language. Only a few stone monuments are preserved in Mongolia, so you can see some examples of those stone monuments. They're not necessarily written by Uyghurs, but as example, you can see how they look like. But there, this topic is not specifically picked up as a central one. Otherwise, official chronicles of Tang Dynasty in China documented the diplomatic and political issues of the Uyghurs, its powerful neighbor at the time, carefully and with great interest. But they do not mention the legitimation of the Uyghur rulers either. Still, they preserved almost all Uyghur rulers' titles in which the idea of the legitimation is reflected. So here you can see the titles of the rulers, almost all titles, during the period of East Uyghur Khaganate. Among the many elements which are used in the Uyghur rulers' titles, Tengri, heaven, or Kud, divine fortune, definitely played an important role. Especially, heaven was recognized as a source of the ruler's power already in the period of Tuzre, the Turkish-speaking nomadic tribe who ruled Mongolia as the Uyghurs' predecessor. The Uyghurs also inherited this idea about heaven. Thus, the titles in which heaven is mentioned as the source of the ruler's divine fortune reflect this Turkic nomadic tradition, which was widespread in the Eurasian steppes. So you can see the red words, it's Tengri. So the Kud, divine fortune came from heaven, or it was found in the heaven. In the East Uyghur Khaganate, however, the relevant change happened on the Uyghurs' belief, introduction of Manichaeism. It was the third Uyghur ruler who decided to accept this Iranian religion. Although there was a short interruption from the seventh ruler's period onward, the Uyghur rulers promised their continuous support to the Manichaean Church and its followers. For the conversion to Manichaeism, two reasons are suggested. One is political, while the other is economic. The ruler needed one world religion representing his empire, which had to be different from those of the rival empires. It means Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Taoism, Judaism or Khazar, and so on. The other is the crucial connection with Sogdian, an Iranian speaker, who were active as merchants along the trade route between East and West. They were also famous as Manichaeans, and the close connection with them promised an economic advantage for the nomadic rulers. So because of that, you can see this religious shift is reflected in the ruler's title too. Since the eighth ruler, all rulers have either I, moon, or Kun, sun, as the first element of their title. Those elements, especially the moon, were added because in Manichaean teachings, those celestial objects had a significant function. From this fact, we can derive a conclusion that, at least from the period of the eighth rulers onward, the Uyghur rulers called for the source of their ruling power on Manichaean divine force. So you can see the green was from the eighth ruler on. You can see I Tengri there, it's moon, or Kun Tengri there, sun, and again I Tengri there, it's moon. So divine fortune now is should be found in moon or on the moon or on the sun or from the sun or from the moon. For this relevant change, the shift of the Uyghur ruling clans probably played a significant role too. Since the seventh one, the rulers belonged to the clan called Ediz, which differs from that of the former rulers, Yagrakal. Although the seventh ruler, the first one from the Ediz clan, underlined his peaceful handover from the Yagrakal clan, he sent members of the latter clan to the Chinese court. Also, he identified himself as a member of Yagrakal clan. Those facts indicate that the change of the ruling clans caused some infighting, and the name Yagrakal kept its authority even after the Ediz clans coming into power. Thus, it could be one of the essential motivations to make Manichaean legitimation visible. After the collapse of the East Uyghur Khaganate, 850, a significant part of the Uyghurs left Mongolia and migrated west. Besides the Uyghur group, which founded the West Uyghur Kingdom, there was the other group which settled down around the oasis Ganzhou. This group founded the so-called Ganzhou Uyghur Kingdom. The exact foundation process of the Ganzhou Uyghur Kingdom remains unclear, but its ruler seems to have been established. Its rule seems to have been established around 890. The rulers of this kingdom maintained the relationship with the Tang dynasty as the legitimated successor of the East Uyghur Khaganate rulers, namely those from the Yaglakar clan. Like this kingdom, the lack of the sources causes the unclearness of the West Uyghur Kingdom's early history. Shortly after 840, the leader called Pam Tegin entered into Kashgar area with his followers. In 866, the leader of the Uyghurs, who was situated in Beshbarik, Puguchun, occupied Tufan and established his rule of the West Uyghur Kingdom. Puguchun seems to have subjected the ruler in Kashgar first, but whether they belonged to the same clan or not is unclear. However, the former's occupation of Tufan means a certain change of ruler's genealogy. In regard to their religion, they kept their Manichaean belief for a while in the West Uyghur Kingdom too. This summary shows that the West Uyghur Kingdom had fights among the leaders until the suitable rule was established. Furthermore, it is not likely that Puguchun stemmed from the Yaglakar clan, which ruled the East Uyghur Khaganate, while the rulers of Ganzhou Uyghur Kingdom claimed their belonging to this clan. In this situation, it was vital for him to show how his rule is legitimatized. His target was first and foremost the Uyghurs, both who came together with him and who already migrated in the Tufan area during the period of the East Uyghur Khaganate. For them, the rule of the West Uyghur Kingdom had to be legitimatized as a successor state of their Khaganate in Mongolia. While the Uyghur rulers' official title in the period of East Uyghur Khaganate, around 100 years, is well preserved, this is not the case in that of the West Uyghur Kingdom, around 300 years. Under this kingdom's rule, the rulers do not seem to have built any stone monuments more because of their sedentary lifestyle. Instead of that, they began to write down their language, Old Uyghur, on paper with their script, Uyghur script. So you can see here some examples of those paper documents written by the Uyghurs in their language and with their script. Through the archaeological expeditions, therefore, many paper fragments were found from the Tufan ruins, one of the centers of the West Uyghur Kingdom. Up to now, however, any state libraries or the whole kingdom's chronicles were found. Thus, the Uyghurs' first-hand information on the lineage of this kingdom's ruling house is lacking. Furthermore, dynasties in central China did not pay much attention anymore either because of the long geographical distance to the West Uyghur Kingdom on the one hand, and because of their political instability on the other hand. Even though various texts inform us at least titles of 10 rulers, most of which were found in the Tufan area by chance. None of those titles is preserved in the text, which shows the characteristics of being an official document, so that it remains unclear whether they are complete ones or short forms. If it is allowed to take the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 10th ruler, so you can see the red ones, as the complete and official titles, they still included the celestial object Kyun, sun, and or I, moon, which were introduced under the Manichaean influence. The continuous use of those elements indicates that there was no visible shift in the legitimation of the Uyghur rulers in the period of the West Uyghur Kingdom, so far as we observe the ruler's title. Considering the political rivalry with the Ganchu Uyghur Kingdom, Manichaeism was an essential factor to legitimate the rule of the West Uyghur Kingdom as the successor of the East Uyghur Khaganate. Unlike those of the Ganchu Uyghur Kingdom, the rulers of the West Uyghur Kingdom could not claim their genealogy belonging to the Yaglakar clan, as mentioned above. Thus, the support for Manichaean church and community was the evidence for the legitimation of the rules, the origin of which should stem from the East Uyghur Khaganate in the Eurasian steppe. The essential role of Manichaeism for the legitimation of the rulers in the West Uyghur Kingdom is shown also by the other sources, for example, the Uyghurs' ancestor legend, Bokuk Kagan legend. While many other nomadic tribes commonly have the animal like a wolf, their ancestor, the Uyghur swan, Bokukkan, was described as a supernatural being. He was born from the trees north, on which the light from heaven streamed down. Here, several Manichaean elements, the tree and the light from heaven, played an important role. The introduction of Manichaeism in the East Uyghur Khaganate probably served as the impetus for the creation of this legend. However, the final version was established first in the period of the West Uyghur Kingdom, because it also mentions the Uyghurs' migration. Thus, the rulers of the West Uyghur Kingdom could claim their connection to those of the East Uyghur Khaganate through representing it as their ancestor legend. The further evidence that Manichaeism played an essential role for the legitimation is the Manichaean eulogies, which were connected with the Uyghur rulers and their state. 6 eulogies in in Middle Persian and Old Uyghur were dedicated to the Uyghur rulers or realm. Especially the so-called enthronement hymn M919 indicates that they were probably produced for use in official ceremonies to legitimate the rule of the newly established West Uyghur Kingdom in public. For this contribution, the rulers also gave the financial support to the Manichaean monasteries so that the Manichaean community and the Uyghur rulers established a relationship of mutual assistance. The majority of the Uyghurs in the West Uyghur Kingdom stayed Manichaeans for a while, but gradually the influence of Buddhism became stronger. After the short coexistence period, in the second half of the 10th century or at the beginning of the 11th century, Buddhism won the support of the Uyghur ruling clans and became the dominant religion for the Uyghurs. For the introduction of Buddhism, the Buddhist inhabitants in the Turfan area, Chinese and Tocharians, so Indo-European language speaker, played an essential role. Little by little, however, the Chinese influence became dominant, for that the close relationship with the neighboring oasis state, Dunhuang, made a significant contribution. The preserved Buddhist texts in Old Uyghur indicates that many Chinese texts spread in Dunhuang served as the original of Old Uyghur translations. It shows the essential influence even after the religious shift. The rulers kept their it shows essential influence of the Chinese Buddhism. And even after the religious shift, the rulers kept their financial support to the Buddhist monasteries as it was the case of the Manichaean ones. Thus, we can also expect that the relationship of mutual assistance, which the Manichaean community established with the Uyghur rulers, also with the Buddhist community. In that case, the latter should replace the Manichaean one and play a prominent role in the rulers' legitimation, although the Buddhist support for it does not seem to be reflected in the preserved ruler's title. So you can see it again, it stayed as it was like in the East Uyghur Khaganate. So still they have Ai Tengri or Kyun Tengri. So, but it does not, however, mean that the Buddhists generally did not provide any support for the Uyghur legitimation. At that time, in several neighboring states in Central Asia, Buddhism was their primary religion, and their rulers actively and systematically promoted it in different ways. So systematical copying and translating of texts, or a creation and restoration of Buddhist caves by rulers' donation. Those activities are often documented in colophons, prayer texts, or inscriptions, and the figures of the rulers are presented as donors on the wall paintings too. Further, some of those rulers, like the governors of Guizhun in Dunhuang, an oasis state neighboring Trufan, saw themselves as a Buddhist king, a Chakravartin, or a Buddhist king, Bodhisattva king. It seems that this type of the legitimation was visible in texts about the rulers in the rulers in Dunhuang, especially in the 10th century. It was probably caused by the demise of the Tang dynasty, the acknowledgement of which was an essential source of the legitimation for the governors of Guizhun, and the authority of the successor dynasties in central China could not replace the role of the Tang dynasty entirely. Thus, the rulers in Dunhuang required the new legitimation for the stabilization of their rule. In this context, it is also worthy of mentioning the function of Mount Wutai for the legitimation. This mountain is located in northwest China and became famous as the residence of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, especially in the late Tang period. This mountain gathered the royal support of the Tang court. It was closely connected with newly introduced legitimation of the Tang emperors, whose authority became diminished because of the diplomatic conflict with the Tang's powerful neighboring state at that time. In that legitimation, the Tang emperor was equated with Chakravartin, specifically the gold wheel turning sage king. Various Chinese neighbors like Tangut and various neighbors of Chinese like Tangut and Khitam also adopted this legitimation idea and created their local Mount Wutai in their territory. In Dunhuang, Mount Wutai was also well known, and the eulogies on these mountains are identified among the manuscripts found in Dunhuang too. Furthermore, one Mogao cave, so Dunhuang's famous Buddhist cave, Cave 61, on the west wall of which the entire range of Mount Wutai is depicted, was probably created as the local Mount Wutai in Dunhuang. This cave was sponsored by the governor Chang Yuanzong, who was equated with the gold wheel turning sage king in one prayer text. It shows that the governors in Dunhuang also adopted this Buddhist legitimation idea. Those facts indicate that Buddhism offered the efficient legitimation and that some rulers in Uyghur neighborhoods actively adopted it to legitimate their rule. Those rulers are often mentioned in various Buddhist texts, which were even not sponsored by them. It shows that the ruler's position in Buddhist context was known and accepted by the Buddhist inhabitants in their ruling territory. The Uyghur rulers, however, do not seem to have adopted some of those Uyghur Buddhist legitimations. Up to now, no conclusive trace of organized copying or translating the Buddhist texts or creation of the Uyghur canons during the period of the West Uyghur Kingdom is found. Some figures on the wall paintings are identified as the Uyghur kings, but in most cases, the evidence for their identification is lacking. Also, Uyghur rulers are not present in Buddhist texts with a few exceptions. In Manichaean literature, eulogies dedicated to the rulers are produced and seem to have been used in the official ceremonies to show the ruler's legitimation in public. However, the number of Buddhist eulogies, the topic of which is the Uyghur rulers or their kingdom, is not high, and they do not seem to have had such an official function. Further, the Uyghurs' Manichaean ancestor legend, Bogukhan legend, appears to have been known by the Buddhists who tried to make this. The Buddhist version was, however, probably not taken as the official one by the rulers because this legend is recorded some sources dated in the 13th, 14th century, and they all document the Manichaean version. Furthermore, the worship of Mantutai also does not seem to have become popular among the Uyghurs in the period of the West Uyghur Kingdom. The eulogy on that mountain was translated from Chinese into Old Uyghur. This translation cannot be dated, so that the possibility that the Uyghur version of this eulogy was already provided in the period of the West Uyghur Kingdom cannot be denied entirely. The Uyghur version of the relevant Buddhist texts for the worship of Mantutai, however, was provided first in the Mongolian period, and many traces of this mountain's worship also suggest its fluorescence, preferably in the later period. Those facts indicate that the introduction of Buddhism and its widespread did not lead to the change of the Uyghur rulers' legitimation. It does not, however, mean that the Uyghur rulers were not interested in the Buddhist community. As mentioned above, the official and financial support was continuously given to the Buddhist monasteries like that of the Manichaean ones. Furthermore, the monks were appointed by the Uyghur rulers to the celestial positions, which formed a part of the ruling system. Thereby, the high-ranking positions were given to both monks who followed the Chinese and Dzogchen traditions. It indicates that the Uyghur rulers put religious communities in their kingdom under their control continuously, so that they have treated the Manichaean and Buddhist communities in the same way. The only essential difference is that the rulers do not seem to have expected the intensive support of the Buddhist community for their legitimation, or they did not intend to make it visible like the Manichaean one. I'm coming to conclusion. Between the 8th to 13th century, the Uyghurs experienced various changes and had contact with different groups, which were mostly non-Turkic speakers, especially the migration from the Eurasian steppes to the Central Asian oases caused the change in lifestyle, nomadic to sedentary. In their sedentary life in the Turfan area, the Uyghurs kept up many customs and traditions which they had as nomad in the Eurasian steppes. The legitimation of the rulers, however, were one of the essential ones which had to be kept in the newly established West Uyghur Kingdom. It was necessary to claim its legitimation as a successor state of the Khaganate in Mongolia. In this sense, official support to the Manichaean community was relevant because it was the region of the Khaganate, and the Manichaean community also gave an assistance to legitimate the ruler's position. When Buddhism was introduced, the rule of the kingdom was stabilized, and its legitimation was not necessarily changed urgently. Furthermore, Mongolia, the territory of the Khaganate, seems to have remained as the origin place in the Uyghurs' memory. Otherwise, kingdom had not only Buddhist states as its neighbors, but also Muslim ones like Karahanis on its western side, and there were probably some Muslims under its rule too. In these multi-religious circumstances, it was also not the best method to exploit the preference to Buddhism in such a manner as to change the legitimation. In addition, in Central Asia, the trade between the neighboring oases was an important financial source to keep the state stable. In this condition, the religious issue was rather secondary, so that the Uyghur rulers did not see any strong needs to change the original legitimation, which was positively accepted by many inhabitants under their rule, even after their religious shift. So, thank you for your attention. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Yukio, for that very interesting presentation. And we'll move right ahead with Dr. Brian Miller as our next speaker.
Today, I want to talk about the Silk Road area, or actually only one part of what is the Greater Silk Road area, and that is parts of the Tian Shan Mountains, mostly which is the Xinjiang part of northwest modern-day China. And the first thing to talk about coming out of the title, or I should say the subtitle of my talk with this contesting nodes and competing networks, is the idea that empires, while they may have sort of a core united homeland or core area, that they often get most of their resources from these far-reaching communities, colonies, a lot of different other things. Among archaeologists, there are a host of different terms that people throw around, including imperial islands that Parker talked about, disembedded centers, such as what Al-Kanini has talked about, and a whole host of them. But the main point is to think about these empires not just as a singular blob that grows bigger and bigger, but that they're sort of casting out these wide areas. In this map of the American empire, they refer to them as lily pads. But this gives you an idea of what we're really talking about is these sort of far-flung nodes that empires will go out to try and control everything that's happening, mostly economics, in these far-flung territories. Most of the narrative of this time period, and this is roughly 200 BC or 100 BC more likely, all the way through about 100 or 200 AD, is dominated by the Chinese narrative of what's going on. There are talks about the heavenly horses, that only being this sort of mythical representation of actual diplomacy. The idea of the Great Walls extending out, that the only kind of real extension of empire is one that has to have obvious physical built infrastructure. And what I'm trying to do today is sort of flip the narrative, hence the title of my talk, talking about the Xiongnu Han era, not the Han Xiongnu era. Little things to sort of bring to light, better light, this other empire that was out there even before the Han Empire, Han Chinese Empire got involved at all. And so while we may have maps such as this is just one of the many types of blobs that are sort of drawn for the Chinese Empire. Even within these sort of blobs, you can see that some of these nodes of imperial extension lie within the drawn lines of a single polygon, or some of them, Juyuan, especially Bayan Boluk in southern Mongolia, are things that are lying well outside those territories. And that's what we should be thinking about when we flip over to the Xiongnu, which was another empire as well. So I'm not going to talk about all of the frontiers. The first one being the western part of what is now Mongolia was one of the frontiers of the Xiongnu Empire. And for there, I just put a citation if you want to know more about that. But the general idea of looking at that frontier is to what degree were the communities way out in this new frontier of the Xiongnu expanding empire In what ways did they change their social structures, their practices, cultural practices, social practices that we can see in the archaeological record? And for this, if you look at some of the communities, there's definitely a shift in burial practices, especially by the later period of the Xiongnu Empire, that over time, through the course of the Xiongnu Empire, more and more they're adhering to all the practices and sort of the way of expressing this formal membership in and participation in the Xiongnu political network and political system. Down in the so-called Great Wall frontier between the Xiongnu and the Han, this is more of an area where you have this sort of not just spatial, but this social middle ground where you have the communities in between that are trying to sort of navigate and negotiate their presence between these massively expanding and heavily overlapping regimes. And so when we go out to the area that is what is now Xinjiang, into the so-called Silk Roads areas, these are areas that are much further from the real core realms of either the Xiongnu or the Han. And we can start to look at what kinds of things empires are really doing out there in these sort of lily pads or whatever else you want to call them. So to flip over, the first thing to look about is we do know from the texts that before the Han Chinese Empire ever even got involved, that the Xiongnu actually went out to Xinjiang, to what is called the Western regions. And they established a servant commandant who was under the guise of one of the Western kings, Western Xiongnu kings. And so this regional king then had his own extension all the way out here, and it was placed somewhere in the Yanqi Basin. And even from the scant texts, we know that he was collecting taxes on behalf of the Xiongnu Empire and shipping it all back. When we think about what taxes are collected, what goods were being brought in, the typical idea of the Xiongnu Empire and its political economy focuses heavily on agriculture, this idea that the Xiongnu couldn't produce any agriculture and were heavily dependent on everyone around them for agriculture. But we know now, not only from some historical analyses as well as archaeological and scientific archaeological analyses, that was not the truth. But the Xiongnu were developing their own small little enclaves of agriculture. And so what it's really about in extending into this area is the idea that the empire needed surplus, as all empires do. And the kinds of tax and tribute that the Xiongnu were collecting from the areas all around them, including the Western regions, was mostly in the form of livestock or sheep and goat pelts. But that's not to say there wasn't a diversity of resources. There's not only grains, textiles of all sorts, other random exotic food and other goods like grapes and wine, and even in some areas in the area of like Lopnor or Lolan, which was called the Abundant Sea of Reeds, because that area had really excellent fodder for cattle and horses. So there's a whole host of resources that were out there. And so it's no surprise when the Chinese finally get involved, they come all the way out there and put their own sort of center to try and collect taxes to compete with what the Xiongnu were doing. And for this talk, there are many different possibilities, but archaeologically speaking, I just want to touch on two of the sort of nodes of contestation. One is a Gushi, which is in the Turpan Basin. It's also called Jushi for that. And this is our local cultural history names that we know from the Chinese documents, and also Lolan. And then as well, at the very end, I want to extend beyond this sort of area of more direct competition between the Xiongnu and the Han empires and other people, and go all the way out past the Tian Shan Mountains, or right at the edge of them, to see what that looks like as well. And from the texts, and the Han Chinese were writing a lot about the Xiongnu because they were the largest enemy and the biggest competitor. And in the small descriptions, when the Chinese talk about what the Xiongnu were doing out there, that they were taking the early conquest took over places or groups like the Gushi and the Lolan, and then used them as the, quote, eyes and ears of the empire. So when we try and look at archaeological evidence for, were there any big enclaves or groups of actual Xiongnu peoples that were moving out there and sort of settling in, this idea that an empire goes out and it has to create a colony, the sort of Tuntian agricultural colonies that the Han Chinese were doing in some of these Western areas. I want to at least review, like, what do we know about the material culture that is attributed to groups within the Mongolian heartland that are called Xiongnu. And the most important thing to look at is pottery, of course. Most of them were fine grayware pots. Storage jars as well as cooking pots are the majority of what's placed in graves of the Xiongnu. Even though at settlement sites, campsites, or these pit house villages, we know that they had plenty of other ceramics like bowls and cups and such. The tendency for Xiongnu graves is they will have these composite bows, and we know a lot of the bone bow plates from them, and they're of a particular style with a sort of curved top. The arrows that they have are very specific kinds. These 3-wing or tri-lobe iron arrows, and some of them in the earlier period have bronze equivalents of these tri-lobe arrowheads. Amongst the goods that are considered sort of prestige goods for any local elites participating in the Xiongnu political network, we see a difference between the goods that they all had, which were very, very similar across the different regions of the empire. And you have this sort of spectrum of goods. A lot of them were these cowrie shell belts, sometimes real cowries, sometimes imitations made out of bone or any other material. A lot of them also had little bronze Chinese coins on the belts themselves. And some of them could be these stone plates with these geometric designs, sometimes inlays, or a whole series of open work bronze belt plates. And the key of this slide is to show you that even though you have the same general concept of these really fancy belts that could identify you as part of the Xiongnu network, depending on what part of the empire you're at. This is around Lake Baikal area. Here you're in northern China. At the bottom left, now you're in Tuva area. And then over here on the bottom right, this is a grave in the heart of central Mongolia that is also picking up some burial practices with the whole horse on the side of groups that had usually been in power in the Altai Mountains. So you have a lot of diversity in the way they're burying. They're allowed a lot of flexibility, even though the sort of badges of political culture seem to be all the same. And you see a lot of uniformity in these badges of political culture everywhere. Some of these like griffins and the sort of horned beast that McFarlane was talking about earlier, the Xiongnu are definitely picking up from themes that had been around and been present for the expression of political and cultural power in Inner Asia, as well as adding a lot of other types of goods such as yaks and horses. And this is one example of how you can see that even though the belt plaques were the same as far as the general composition, the people being, or the animals being depicted in this case, the grappling horses, in one region you could have a different border from a totally different one, but the same concept is still there. There's a whole field of research done by my colleague Ursula Brositer on the styles of belts for the Xiongnu period and the metal compositions as well. So I won't go into that right now. But when we get to things besides what's in the heartland of the Xiongnu, we can go and look at this Yanqi Basin area and ask the question, if this is the center of Xiongnu imperial power in these Western regions, then is there any evidence of a community, a Xiongnu affiliated community settling in there? And we don't really see much, even though some of the graves, the site of Chaohu has a lot of occupation going well before the Xiongnu period into the Bronze Age. And so by the time we get to the Xiongnu era, we do see small burial sites, clearly of primarily pastoral groups with animal sacrifices in their graves. But the way they're burying the animals, the form of their graves, and most importantly, the kinds of pottery that they have indicate that these are still local pastoral groups and not any sort of Xiongnu affiliated groups coming in. So the question, there's a question of, well, where is the Xiongnu enclave? If it was so powerful with some sort of military political leader who was collecting taxes from the Western regions. When we go to some of the other nodes, such as Lolan, which were supposedly these local powerful groups that became the eyes and ears of the Xiongnu, we can also see that there's no indication of any of them adopting Xiongnu burial practices or anything else. They still are having multiple people in a grave, even though they're primarily pastoral in their in their ritual offerings. The pottery, again, is very much local, dominated by red ware instead of the fine gray ware that we see in Mongolia. They have a lot of Chinese goods, and so people have emphasized, the connection with Chinese people coming out in this time period. These sort of trading caravans and diplomats and entourages coming out to try and sway local groups over to the Chinese side. But the interesting thing is that when you see something like, say, a Chinese mirror here, it's broken and it's not whole. And this is interesting because it's a particularly Xiongnu practice. Even though Chinese bronze mirrors eventually spread across the whole of the Eurasian continent, when you look at how they're treated and how they're buried, it's a particular Xiongnu tendency to break them apart. So something like this object could have come from China, or it could have been traded through interactions with the Xiongnu in actuality. And when we look at all the grave goods in some of the burials around Lolan, Lopnor A and Lopnor Cemetery B, we can also see plenty of other fine wool and textiles and felts, which were among the products of Inner Asia. As far as anyone that might be a real Xiongnu constituent, we see very simple belts, this sort of curved end form with a felt belt and a painted wooden thing that are very similar to either bronze or to bone belt plates or belt clasps that we see in the Xiongnu heartland. But the really interesting thing is the presence of some of these bronze belt plates that have a clear signal of the people wearing these are somehow affiliated with or directly integrated into the Xiongnu political system. And it's found in an area just north of the Turpan Basin. And what we know minimally from the Chinese text is that when the Chinese went out to this area and started really competing with Xiongnu influence, the Xiongnu and the Han Chinese were fighting over the Turpan Basin, and eventually the kings of the Gushi or Jushi split, so that some of them went north of the Tian Shan Mountains, north of the Turpan Basin, and became a power base that was more adherent to the Xiongnu, and those that were in the Turpan Basin then became more adherent to the Chinese. And so we can see how some of these really interesting nodes of contestation could start to split apart. But when we try and understand, what about the people that are out there, the local leaders, the local groups, and how they sort of navigated their presence between these really intrusive, aggressively intrusive regimes, at the actual site of Jiaohe, the supposed site of the Gushi kings, we see the presence of graves that are not Han in style, nor are they in the same style as any sort of Xiongnu elites, but they're also radically different from any pre-existing cultures for burials of the elites. There's a new push to have overly monumental graves, the kinds that have never been seen before, even though some of these smaller ones that are surrounding the large graves here, these large tombs here, are very much in line with previous cultures, such as the Xubeixi culture and other groups. The burial pits of animals where they were burying whole horses and sometimes even whole camels. All these things show, and pottery as well, show a definite affiliation with the pre-existing groups that were already out there. But any of the uber elites in the Turpan Basin start to gain a lot of power and express that power in monumental graves that had never been seen before. And amongst these are all these gold foil decoratives, camels and other things. And this is one of the most interesting ones of these elite graves in this cemetery, is that you have this piece of gold foil, pressed gold foil, which was not a normal way during the early Xiongnu period for belt decoration, but it's almost an exact imitation of some of the normal Xiongnu bronze belt pieces, which means there's some sort of relationship in which the local kings of the Turpan Basin are attempting to demonstrate adherence to previous practices. They're having this clear demonstration of independence, but they're emulating some of the styles and emblems of power between these competing groups that are coming in and trying to interfere with their own local politics. One of the other graves at Jiaohe, the western Jiaohe Cemetery, has a whole host of goods. Some of these goods that are, again, the gold foil, the pressed gold foil that's imitating some of the Xiongnu belt pieces, as well as actual Xiongnu style belt pieces, and even Xiongnu style pottery, as we see here. But a lot of the pottery, again, is very local in style. And even some of these crowns look somewhat imitative of decorations that had existed just in the period before the rise of the Xiongnu. And then we move to what I'm calling the more long distance game. Something happens when we get past the Tian Shan Mountains into Fergana and Bactria and all the regions out there. Not only does the specific set of scenes or motifs that are normal among Xiongnu bronze belt plaques sort of disappear, we start to get another sort of version of Central and Western Eurasia appearing all in this area. We do see some of the normal Xiongnu belt pieces penetrating that area, but none of the normal bronze ones, only the sort of the stone ones with inlays. And of course, we see Chinese bronze mirrors going out there as well. But the vast majority that are going out there are no longer broken. So they're clearly not getting these directly from Xiongnu interactions. And when we look at some of the graves where these Xiongnu style belt pieces are being found, we see that even though all of the accoutrements, the exact style of bone attachments for the bows with a nice rounded top as opposed to a flat top, we see the arrowheads and everything else seem to be sort of Xiongnu accoutrements, the cowrie shell belts with these specific Xiongnu style bronze openwork belt ring, the stone belt plate. Everything seems to be that, except the manner of the pit, the way the body is oriented, and most telling, the pottery itself, the sort of flat-sided belly jar, is absolutely local. And so there's a whole spectrum of possibilities that it's almost impossible to know, because there's not many of these graves that are like this. But it could be a whole spectrum of somebody who was a constituent of the Xiongnu Empire, went out there, passed away, then was buried by the locals. It could be this sort of interactions between Xiongnu constituents and sort of entourages coming out, trading with the local elites, gifting them a Xiongnu style belt. It's difficult to say, and only I think something like specific genetics could start to answer those types of questions. So to talk about, to sum up and talk about the impact of the Xiongnu expansion, we can talk about what happens in the Western regions as the Xiongnu are going out. From both archaeology and history, especially history, you can talk about the shifting geopolitics. The group of the Yuezhi that are pushed out by the Xiongnu eventually come all the way over here, end up in this part of Central Asia, splitting apart. One of these Yuezhi groups eventually establishes the Kushan Empire. But you have all these powerful groups that are out there. The case of the Yuan and the Battle of Osh at their capital, where the Han come out, try and capture the capital. They never really take it, but they bring in the Kangju and they bring in the Wusun, and the Xiongnu are brought into this whole conflict, even though the Xiongnu never are able to arrive in time. But you can see how this multiplayer game just explodes. But the reverse should also be talked about. When the Xiongnu are expanding into some of these Western areas and really pushing as hard as they can into Central Asia, by the later part of the Xiongnu Empire, you see an extreme rise in not just these sort of very steppe traditional prestige goods and badges of political power that we saw on the bronze openwork belt plates, but you see a radical increase in the number of foreign exotic goods, such as these little turquoise and gold buttons that are all over the clothing of the uber elites in the Xiongnu Empire. In the big square tombs that are attributed to the rulers, you see these Hellenistic style discs and even these textiles that are attributed to Central Asia production somewhere. And even Egyptian style faience beads. And I say style to say that we're not really sure if they're actually coming from Egypt. We'd have to have a really good analysis, such as the kinds that Professor Langton does. And lastly, we can see a real alteration of the genetic makeup within the heart of the empire. Just as any empire does, it moves people around, whether by opportunity for people to come in, from different parts of the surrounding realms, or by force, forcibly going into an area that you conquer. You cut off the local elite power. Either you kill them or you forcibly move them to another part of your own empire. But there's something happening in the Xiongnu Empire period where there's a great increase in the diversity of demographics. And that's something that should be talked about as well. So when we look back to the dynamics and the sort of history of the Silk Roads area, we should try our best to remember that it's not just the Chinese going out there and that everybody else is sort of, secondary players, but that the Xiongnu played just as much of a role out there as the Chinese did. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brian, for that very, very fascinating presentation. I think we'll go ahead then with just a few discussion points and then a question and answer for the panelists and for those participating online. In thinking about the three papers presented today, there were several things that that came to mind. It seems like there are a lot of common themes in the papers, and then of course differences in approach to the material. So I wonder if Sanjot, if you could put on that first slide of mine. These were some thoughts that that I had in sort of response to the preliminary versions that I saw of the papers, and I think they may be useful for the versions that were presented today. I was thinking about three aspects that are covered really in pretty much all three of the papers: religion, globalization, and socialization. Religion, and I put on the Silk Road there on purpose. It's the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, but in addition, the Silk Road, I think, hangs very importantly over all considerations, even from the Iron Age going into the Xiongnu period. Iron Age is probably a bit early to speak about Silk Road trade, but there certainly was trade, and economic concerns were very important. And then it became probably increasingly obvious going in finally to the period of the Uyghur Khaganates. In terms of religion, I used the same definition, but from Geertz that Katie used in her presentation: the structured system of beliefs and symbols important in everyday life. There's not really much about spirituality in this definition, but and I'm not sure how this particular definition would relate to the way that we think of religion, in this century. But I think it's certainly a way of looking at it in terms of past societies. Globalization and socialization were defined by Sheldon Gosline, and I borrowed this from one of Brian's recent articles in a book that he and Ursula Brossiter edited. I'll give the reference for that in a few minutes. Globalization, I mean, is a concept that, if you look in the University of California Library at Berkeley, there are three shelves of books on globalization, each one having a slightly different definition. But I think Gosline's definition is pretty simple and easy to grasp, and that's globalization is a connections through economic networks. So it doesn't imply necessarily any kind of socialization. It doesn't imply that cultures are globalized, but simply that there's connection through economic networks. Socialization, by contrast, is a more cohesive approach where social networks become more important and social practices may be changed, including some of the practices that would be considered under religion. For instance, grave practices, how bodies are displayed, etc. Brian considered these two concepts in particular in terms of the Xiongnu settlements in the Western Xiongnu territory, but I think they apply equally well to those that he was speaking of, those lily pads that he was speaking about today. Now, in Katie's presentation, of course, religion probably plays the major role in her studies, assuming or suggesting that the animal style art objects can be interpreted as religious symbols, and that they're sharing over such wide periods of time and also great distances implies some sort of religious understanding that's shared as well. In terms of globalization through economic networks, I think although she didn't discuss this directly, I think certainly the animal style objects found at different areas could also imply some economic connections. There's also some overlap with socialization, and that if these objects are religious objects and have religious significance, then of course that does imply some differences in social understanding and perhaps changed understanding as these objects are exchanged and traded over the landscape. There's also an emphasis on religion in Yukio's presentation. In this case, she's speaking about the Manichaean conversion of the Uyghur elites in Mongolia and the changes in their titles in terms of legitimation of their rule. And this certainly would be an important way of looking at it. I think not necessarily the only way, and I'm sure she would agree with this, in that changing titles, people change titles for a number of reasons. One may be legitimation. Another could be, as she mentioned, economic concerns, where connections with Sogdian traders were very important in terms of keeping business going. And that was really the lifeblood of the Uyghurs, who depended a lot on trade for their economy. So in terms of globalization, although we didn't discuss it directly, it certainly could be a part of this Manichaean conversion, where the Uyghur community and the Uyghur rulers became more friendly to Sogdian traders, making sort of a warm haven for them with Manichaean monasteries and religious institutions being supported, and a Manichaean network for Sogdians, that many of whom were apparently Manichaean. In terms of socialization in the Uyghur communities and how many people actually participated in this Manichaean conversion, I think it's not so clear. Yukio can perhaps fill us in more of what the evidence is for community participation in this. The written sources are quite limited, as she pointed out. So it may be very difficult based on the written sources to really have much of an idea of how much community participation there was. Brian's presentation touched a bit more on all three of these aspects, certainly talking about at these Western outposts of the Xiongnu, differences in grave structure and ritual, sometimes similar. Certainly in terms of grave goods, there were similarities in many of the higher prestige graves in the Western regions, but often in terms of more important socialization issues, did the people's beliefs really change? The grave structure often seemed to be more related to the local structures and local beliefs. Certainly the globalization economic value was very important, and that, as Brian pointed out, was probably one of the raison d'etre of having these Western outposts for collecting taxes, for controlling trade to a certain extent, and the entry of the exotic prestige goods, particularly in the 1st century BC and 1st century CE, is very interesting as well, and certainly and has been taken by many people to be an indicator of increasing globalization during this period. Brian did mention something closer to my heart, the small pendants that are made in blue faience, very similar to those that were being made in Egypt and the Mediterranean at the same time. Whether these were actually made there, as you said, is difficult to know for sure without doing chemical analysis. Certainly there were glass beads found in Xiongnu graves in the more central Xiongnu heartland that are definitely Mediterranean based on chemical analysis. Interestingly, there are very similar looking glass beads that appear to be copies of Mediterranean beads that were made possibly in Iran at the same time. So there is a variety of exotic prestige goods coming in terms of globalization at this point. And the next slide. Let's see if I could have the next slide there. Okay, these are just some references. I just wanted to put this up so it will be on the videos that are available later. This is a reference for Geertz's definition of religion, the reference from Gosline of globalization and socialization. I looked up his profile online. He's an interesting guy. He's a professor in China now. He worked for a long time as an archaeologist and then went back to UCL actually to do a PhD in history of medicine. At any rate, some of his work from archaeology is still being quoted. This is Brian's book that he edited with Ursula Brosseter. I included here, just for those who are interested, a reference to ancient DNA study that came out in 2018 that had quite a few burials from the Xiongnu area, looking at the genetic background of people that are found in these graves, really all over Central Asia. One nice thing about this is that there are supplements, one that summarizes very nicely the archaeological background, and the other that summarizes the linguistic background that helps a lot in understanding the genetic data. So if anyone's interested, this is an excellent start for that kind of study. Right? That's all for the slides. Well, I think we can open up the discussion to the panelists and then to questions from the audience. I think Sanjot's going to handle the audience questions, but panelists, would you like to get started? Katie, shall we start with you? Do you have some questions for either responses to what I said or questions for the other panelists?
Well, thank you very much for your comments, and all the papers were fascinating. So I'm very proud to be part of this session. I appreciate your comments and summary, James. You're right, there's a lot of things I didn't directly discuss because, 20 minutes is not a lot of time. Right. But yes, absolutely. There was probably economic connections, because that's really, there has to have been, from metallurgy, connections, connecting people from the northern regions with the southern. And yes, you're right. There is an implication for a lot of social understanding. I tend to be more on the cautious side of things, and in my interpretations at this point, because I've considered myself at more of like a inductive stage of this whole research thing paradigm. So, as I am able to get into some more details and tease out some more patterns, then I will definitely be looking into these other more specific things. The one thing
that I didn't mention that I meant to is that your work is fantastic in that you've been able to take objects that really, you could think about them as really not being able to give us much archaeological information. Objects from collections from the time of Peter the Great, even, where there's really very little known about their provenience. But by using the methods the statistical methods that you've introduced can really start to get, I think, quite valuable information that might otherwise not really be available. So I just want to to make a special point about that.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, and that's exactly the point. You know, I've originally intended during my dissertation work to look at big macro scale patterns and then compare it with like a local, just like a couple of sites, see how they tease out. Just, you know, events happened and, you know, I had to go all in on macro. And so it meant that we can actually, like you said, use artifacts and try to situate and contextualize artifacts that have just been seen as, you know, art history objects. So I don't really have any specific questions for the other talks, because I think that we are all, well, other than to comment that and just observe that we cover such a wide period of time between the three of us. And it's interesting to see how Brian's and my discussions really do seem to articulate. And with more, you know, I've really actually thought deeply about the Xiongnu contexts and but the material culture that's found in these burials. And I've studied yours and Brossetter's work closely, especially as it regards to the belt buckles. It was very exciting to see, sorry. It was really exciting to see how, like what the whole assemblage is one, you know, because usually, you know, in many articles, and I'm guilty of this in my presentation, I highlighted objects instead of seeing the entire complete picture of what comes from the entire burial. So thank you for that. It's very, like, the whole thing was great. And Hikuyo's discussion is fascinating, because one of the things I've been interested in is Tengrism as a possible ethnographic analogy for what's going on in these early time periods, because it seems to be something that's relevant, internal to North Central Eurasia. I had to cut that part. I was planning on discussing this a little bit based on James's discussion points with me earlier in the week, but there just wasn't time. But I think there's a lot to potentially link these earlier time periods with these concepts of Tengrism. I mean, it won't be exactly the same thing, but there could be ways in which these patterns and, you know, interactions and ideas that people may have had in these earlier time periods may be relevant to what's going on in these later time periods, especially when we start talking about the southern parts. But even in like the Altai region, Mongolia, Urals, possibly. So fascinating.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yukio, did you have any comments or questions for the other participants?
Yes. At first, thank you for your patience. I was a little over my time. And thank you for your comment, James. And I would like to mention some points which you mentioned, and you were right. Economic was very probably an important factor, not only to the for the conversion to Manichaeism, but also it was also indirectly impacted in the introduction of Buddhism, because in Central Asia, you should have economic networks and it have to work very smoothly. So the connection with other neighbors were all the time quite important, but and also how many people supported Manichaeism, also Buddhism. It's in fact very difficult point because the shortage of the materials in the period of Steppe Empire, but also in the period of Central Asian migration, because we have almost the majority of the texts are sutras or commentaries. So we know about the teachings, but we do not know really about the activities of the people, how they dealt with, and everyday life. It's quite difficult to know. So, but they are quite important points in my research too. So thank you for these points.
One other thought that I had with regard to your work was is there any parallel between what you're seeing in the 8th and 9th century with Manichaean influence on the Uyghur rulers with the participation of Brahmins and the Thai royal family today? So for many of the royal family rites, it's essential to have Brahmins there to officiate. They're not any old Brahmin from India, but they're actually fully Thai people who are supposedly descended from Indian families, but their job is to act as Brahmins at the court. So there's no one suggesting that the Thai royal family is Hindu, but Brahmins are very important in the royal rituals.
Yes, in fact, it's quite an interesting point. Of course, the rulers supported and only as lay people, and it wasn't necessary because Manichaean teachings is very peaceful, so they might not care anything. So it's quite not very suitable for nomadic life if you think about the everyday life of nomads. So Manichaeism and nomadic life are not very suitable each other. So, but well, the Manichaean priestess were also very probably, some of them are Sogdians, and they were again also connected with merchants. So it's very complex relationships which they had, and we also do not know very exactly about those relationships. How, and sometimes only one part is focused through the Chinese sources or other sources. And in that case, of course, you can underline those facts, but how the relationship was and how it was dealt as complex is really a quite difficult question.
Yes, no. Well, thank you very much. Brian, do you have some comments or questions for the other panelists?
No, just one little bit of food for thought, which would take too much time to answer now, but both of you talked a lot about religion, and I would just be curious. I think Yukio's, your presentation talked very directly about religion as a political tool. But I think if you're, Catherine, if you're going to talk about religion, even though it's hard because we don't have the same texts clearly, but I think there is great potential because these are, these sort of items of social power, these big belt pieces. Even the tattoos on their skin and stuff, that I would be really curious to see how you then leap into like social and political stuff. But I think there's amazing potential at your massive database.
As it grows, I'm sure things will change and interpretations will become more refined, and might disagree with myself, a couple years from now on some things. But, I was thinking about like the way I've been thinking about, especially specifically your discussions about belt buckles. Actually, I think this is Bressetter's article in a volume from a while ago. I was thinking about Gell and the way he, an article from a while ago, talks about metallurgy and the ability to make objects in these time periods was likely related to power and elite status. So a concept of elite status is very different from what we think of now, right? And it's probably very different from what even people in this, like in states, at the contemporary states at the time, may have even thought about power relationships and structure. So like the occurrence of really, really elite kurgans that are that follow Adrian Mayer's observations that they're near gold and metallurgical sources. We seem to see a lot of trade of metal, and a lot of these really elite objects are made of metal. There's a lot to unpack there, and it's probably very, very intricately tied with economic and political things. So that's just one really brief way that could be articulated together, I think.
Thank you. Sanjot, I see there are a number of questions from the audience. Are there any quick ones that you would like to highlight?
There's actually only, I think, one, and that is, I'll just read it. Is there a current consensus, Ray, the connections between Uyghurs and Xiongnu? Or is that a discarded idea? Who wants to take that on?
I know it's projecting forward from my time period, but nothing that would ever be called genetic or cultural or anything. I think there is, and somebody asked me once, what's the connection between the Xiongnu and the Scythians? There's no genetic or anything there, but there's definitely this sort of, there's the cultural and even political precedent that grows as you're going through time. I mean, if you looked at just the handful of belts that I showed today, you can clearly see parallels to all the stuff that Catherine was talking about. That when the Xiongnu formed their massive polity and were looking around for badges of power, they drew on what was already around there. They drew on this like horned beast where the horns are actually falcon heads, all this stuff. They added some of their own, but they're building on this momentum. So that by the time you get to the Turks and the Uyghurs and all the ones after that, they have this knowledge of this like general like steppe regime heritage that goes on. A lot of people talk about Genghis Khan developing the decimal system. You're like, well, actually, it was already in existence in the Xiongnu times, and they knew that. And so there is that tie, but I wouldn't say there's anything genetic or cultural or anything like that.
I don't see any other questions. Some of them were typed and they were answered.
Okay.
Oh, wait, let me just check. Okay, has there been any genetic work connecting the ancient Xiongnu to the modern Manchus? I think that's even...
I don't think so. As far as any connections between like the different genetic populations, I would just point you to the recent paper by Chungwon Jiang and a bunch of us. Alicia was on it, Will was on it. It was a huge team of people. And the sample size is unprecedented, and it gives a good idea. The last slide that I showed about genetics is taken from a graph from that. And you can see when you look at, genetically speaking, the PCA plot, different groups sort of go here, 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 and then you get to the Xiongnu period, and populations that are in the heartland of the Xiongnu Empire spread across the entire PCA plot. So it's just all over the map. Something is happening there that had never happened before. But yeah, these include relations to populations in northern China, in Manchuria, in Siberia, in Central Asia, and everywhere. So there was a huge genetic diversity at that time.
Okay, maybe we can squeeze in one last quick question. Collecting taxes in an outlying area must have required force. Is there any sign that the tax collector brought troops with him?
There's tiny little archaeological evidence. At the settlement site near Lolan, I only talked about the burials, but when you go to the settlement site itself, you see little scattered evidence. There's bronze crossbow bolt heads, because the Han Chinese were using crossbows. The Xiongnu were using composite bows and arrows. And you also see Xiongnu style arrowheads. And when you go, if we had, really intensive surveys, better reporting, some of the Fazui Jianbao are pretty old. But if you had a lot of them, you can start to pick out this evidence of they're around there. They're leaving behind their arrowheads and other stuff. But there's no indication that these groups were actually settling down, being buried there, having that be their new home. It may be the kind of thing that Catherine was talking about, of where you have, when they died as part of their army, they go all the way back to wherever they're from in the Mongolian heartland to be buried. But yeah, there's no archaeological evidence beyond these scattered like little evidence of Xiongnu style arrowheads all over the place.
Well, great. Then this is perfect. We stopped right at 11. So well done. I want to thank James for being a wonderful discussant and chair of this panel, Katie, Yuki O'Brien, for great talks, and we'll see you all back in an hour. So the second panel will start at 12. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back everybody to the afternoon session of the conference. We're pleased to have three members of this panel for the afternoon. So first up, we're going to have Dr. William Taylor, who is an assistant professor of anthropology and curator of archaeology at the University of Colorado's Museum of Natural History in Boulder. And his research explores ancient human-animal relations with a special focus on the domestication of horses and other large animals and the prehistory of mountain and high-altitude zones, which we'll be hearing about today. Dr. Taylor has received a wide variety of funding to support his research, including major grants from the National Science Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, and the National Geographic Society, and has published extensively on domestication and the spread and use of domesticated animals, and especially horses in both Eurasia and the US Southwest. So Dr. Taylor will be up first. After that, we'll have Dr. Alicia Ventresca-Miller, who is Assistant Curator of Asian Archaeology at the University of Michigan's Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, and also an Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology there. And so Dr. Ventresca-Miller applies isotopic and proteomic methods to investigate the intersection between shifts in food production and the emergence of complex societies in Eurasia. And she takes a multi-species anthropological approach, exploring the role of residential mobility, settlement provisioning, and the adoption of domesticates such as millet and livestock in the move towards urbanization. Dr. Ventresca-Miller's research has received funding from the National Geographic Society, the Max Planck Institute, and the American Center for Mongolian Studies, among others. And she's also published widely on isotopic analysis, so literally writing the book on isotopic investigations of pastoralism, as well as other approaches to and aspects of pastoral societies. Last up today, we'll have Dr. Michael Fricchetti, who's professor of archaeology in the Department of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Fricchetti's research focuses also on pastoralism in the Bronze Age in Central Asia, and particularly on questions of social and economic interaction between regional populations. His theoretical approaches focus on economic and political strategies for interregional communication, and how variability in these strategies can be used to reshape social interactions and landscapes. And he employs a combination of GIS and remote sensing to reconstruct ancient land cover changes, and also looks at these alongside archaeological data from his ongoing fieldwork in Eastern Kazakhstan, which I believe we're going to hear more about today. Dr. Fricchetti's authored a number of books, including Pastoralist Landscapes and Social Interaction in Bronze Age Eurasia, as well as Mobility in Ancient Society in Asia and the Americas, along with dozens of articles on topics including pastoralism, the spread of domesticated plants and animals, ancient mobility patterns, nomadic urbanism, among other topics. And this research has been widely funded by a variety of organizations, including the National Science Foundation, National Geographic Society, and the Arcadia Foundation. So we have three excellent researchers here today, and we're looking forward to hearing from all of them. So first up, we're going to have Dr. Taylor presenting glacial archaeology and high altitude prehistory in the Mongolian steppe.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that lovely introduction. And let me see if I can survive the technological transition here. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. One of the things that's really neat about this type of conference is that you can see on the right-hand side the list of everybody who's watching. It's very humbling to sort of scroll through there and see so many world experts on different aspects of Eurasian history and archaeology, and also so many friends. So like Alicia was mentioning, it makes me feel quite wistful. I wish I could be connecting with all of you in person one way or another. But as Andrew mentioned, my talk today is going to be on something called glacial archaeology. It's a bit of a departure from what you might be used to hearing from me about. It sort of takes me back to my roots as a graduate student when I spent years doing this sort of work here in North America, in Alaska, for my day job, as it were. But you know, as many folks who research and study, oh, I gotta fix the okay, see if the, okay. Many folks who research and study in Eurasia are often really focused on things like, you know, the Great Mongol Empire, the achievements of Genghis Khan, and, you know, these, as many other talks have pointed out today, these emergent processes of sort of connectivity, social complexity, and really important social phenomena that we link to areas like Mongolia and the Eastern Eurasian steppe. But in order to understand those, as many scholars here today have focused on, it's also crucial that we understand the lifeways that sort of underpin some of these important social phenomena. And in Mongolia, right, there's a particularly unique form of lifeway that is sort of a multi-species pastoralism that is highly mobile, uses animals like horses in unique and important ways, an area where horseback riding is still absolutely crucial part of daily life. And so this is, you know, the topic that is sort of guiding a lot of my thinking and my investigations on the issue. I'm from the state of Montana here in the US, and as the name suggests, mountains, you know, are totally central to life where I grew up. And the same is true for most of us who have spent any time in Mongolia, or to be honest, most areas of interior Eurasia, Central Asia somewhere. In Mongolia, mountains are a hotspot for biodiversity, right? There are areas where you find many more kinds of wild plants and animals than you might in other areas. They're also absolutely essential to herders, right? For areas of shelter from winter storms or pasture, precipitation, in any number of ecological reasons. They're also highly significant in other cultural ways, right? Their mountains are often revered. They're this locus for important ritual activity. And I just show here, you know, one of the important ceremonial practices in modern Mongolia is to place the head of a horse at a high point on a mountain, or these cairns called an obo, right? And so, and this tradition goes back centuries and millennia, where mountains have played an essential role in sort of Eurasian pastoral cultures. In Mongolia, mountain zones also boast a couple of sort of unique domestic animals whose early history and prehistory is quite poorly understood in the region. Animals like the yak, which are quite well adapted to colder, high altitude conditions, and the reindeer in some areas of northern Mongolia. As we start to learn more about the early stages of Mongolia's first pastoral societies, we're seeing that mountain zones were absolutely crucial sort of lifelines for these earliest pastoralists to occupy the eastern steppe. And you can kind of see that here in the distribution of archaeological sites linked to these time periods. In the earliest centuries of Mongolia's pastoral prehistory, occupations or funerary sites, any archaeological sites that we can confidently link to this period, are pretty exclusively located in the Altai mountain belt to the west, or the Hangai mountains in the central areas of Mongolia. And that stands in contrast to later periods where, you know, folks, herders were able to make more extensive use of drier areas, intermontane zones, Gobi and eastern steppe zones. And so this has been kind of an interesting phenomena that, you know, has been a focus of some recent archaeological research. However, despite the importance of these mountain zones clearly in the emergence of herding lifeways in Mongolia, the archaeological record is spread particularly thin. For the most part, the only tangible record that we have to understand, the early habitation, occupation, and use of mountain zones comes from things like you see here, funerary sites, right? And a very small handful of funerary sites where we're getting a very limited snapshot into what a particular group of folks would have been doing in terms of their economy, their ecology, and even certain aspects of their material culture, that anything that was not chosen to be represented in a funerary site. And so because of this sort of unique contrast between the outsized significance of mountain zones and their poor representation in the archaeological record, it's been particularly challenging to understand the emergence of pastoral life in Mongolia. And so the question that's really been driving our recent research, and I should mention here that while I'm the one talking, the things that I'm about to share with you are really the result of the efforts of many different folks. My partner, Jamsun Javin Bayersachen at the National Museum of Mongolia, some of my collaborators, I saw Julia maybe was here in the attendees. So there are a lot of folks that put their energy into this work. And in order to get at this, we're turning to kind of a unique data set, and one that's been relatively only recently sort of turned to in the history and prehistory of societies in Mongolia, and to be honest, many other parts of Eurasia, and that is glacial or ice patch archaeology. Now, we all know essentially what a glacier is, right? These sort of slow-moving rivers of ice that occur in colder areas, high altitude areas. But many folks may be less familiar with something called an ice patch. And an ice patch is essentially just a non-glacial permanent bit of snow and ice. And these occur in the colder climates of the world, areas of high latitude and high altitude. And they're akin to the kind of thing, if you live in somewhere like Colorado, that you might get in your front lawn in areas that are sort of shaded from the sun. They might not necessarily be in areas that are cold during the summer months, but just in sort of micro conditions that are favorable to the persistence of snow and ice. Now, in mountain zones in many parts of the world, particularly drier, more arid regions, these snow and ice patches are ecologically and hydrologically extremely important. And that's for a number of reasons. They're quite attractive to big game animals. Certain taxa, particularly those such as reindeer, sometimes bighorn sheep, use them in the summer months for things like thermoregulation, right? So many Arctic or subarctic taxa are not really great at dealing with hot temperatures. And in the summer, as many of us know, it can get quite warm in some of these areas. They also use them to escape insect pressure, right? Parasite-borne diseases are a big problem, particularly in the summer months for many large animals. These areas are also extremely important sources of fresh water for people, plants, and animals. And there are many kinds of plants which grow uniquely in the sort of microenvironments around these sort of melting perennial snow and ice patches. Now, as a result of this, and as a result of their sort of geological stability, humans all around the world, from Montana to Scandinavia, to South America, and essentially everywhere in between, folks that have been living in high altitude zones have been visiting and making use of such patches and leaving behind a cultural material record of their activities, often in the kind of fragile organic materials through which so much of the material culture in places like Mongolia and Central Asia is, but which would not preserve under typical conditions. So there's sort of these, and because of mountain zones are typically extremely high energy, right? Rocks go down the mountain, anything that stays on the ground in a mountain zone, not likely to stay there for very long, right? And so there are also these sort of unique catchment zones for a cultural and biological record of human use of high altitudes. Now, because of this, in recent years, we sort of turned to them to start to understand some of the fuzzier zones of Mongolia's prehistory. And in working in northern Mongolia, one of our discoveries was that for contemporary reindeer pastoralists who occupy a small zone of far northern Mongolia, the ice is actually a critical piece of contemporary reindeer pastoralism. Reindeer use the patches much like their wild sort of caribou counterparts to escape insect stress, to escape heat, and that the rapid melting of these ice patches in recent zones. And so we found that some record of pastoral activity is actually preserved in and melting out of these ice patches in northern Mongolia. You can see the layers of dung and hair here. But we also found that this area is melting sort of exceedingly quickly. And areas of northern Mongolia that are critical for reindeer pastoralism have seen a drastic loss of ice in the last 20 years, most of which, local folks say is the first time in recorded memory. And this is causing issues to the management of pastoral animals, increase in disease, health problems, and of course, a loss of the cultural materials that would be preserved inside them. But this work also showed us, that the scope of melting in Mongolia is such that when we went to the Sayan Mountains in northern Mongolia, we were essentially too late. Almost all of the patches which we visited in 2017 are now completely melted, at least during the peak of the melt season in the summer. And so we relocated our energies towards higher ground. The Altai Mountains are the highest mountain chain in Mongolia, stretching to 4,000 meters and above, as opposed to about 2,500 where we were working before. And so in 2019, we relocated our efforts to this region. And what I'm going to show you is the results from a single sort of period of 3 or 4 weeks of field work, basically the first place that we looked, which is the area where we had conducted some of our earlier archaeological research activities, a site called Single Mountain. And at this single locality, we essentially immediately recovered, identified at least 3 ice or glacier locations that were bearing ancient cultural material melting out of the ice for the first time. You can kind of see the location where we worked here. This is our most important and most productive location, the margin of a glacier at Single Mountain. And this is sort of an overwhelming and sloppy image, but I want to draw your attention to, if I can, and let me see if I can pull up the pin, this area over here, right? This is a massive glacial margin of which we were really only able to survey, it's 4 hours up the mountain, 4 hours down. Most of our team ended up getting altitude sickness. So this is quite a journey, and we were not quite able to do as much work as we would have liked. But this area is one where we conducted a full coverage archaeological survey. And so you can get a sense of what the true density of ancient cultural and faunal material on the mountain is by just looking at this one little sort of 20 by 200 meter zone. And what we recovered was the remains of dozens and dozens of big game animals, largely Argali sheep, but also ibex and red deer, and dozens of ancient cultural material, primarily projectiles from high altitude hunting. Now, this is not something that folks might sort of inherently associate with early pastoralism, but our artifacts give us a really important set of snapshots into what the role of hunting activity in high mountain zones was in early pastoral societies in Mongolia. And these include obviously wild animal remains. These are stacked piles of Argali sheep skulls and horn cores here, probably that have been intentionally stacked, not just for logistics, but perhaps out of the sort of a ceremonial choice you know, dated to around 1700 years ago. One thing that's interesting is that while we would typically find on a ground survey only things like metal projectiles, in fact, we found more organic projectiles than we did metal here. And these are sort of little 3D models of some of the projectiles that we recovered. And they date from a time period stretching from the final Bronze Age all the way through, you know, the Middle Ages. And so it appears that, you know, the aspects of this archaeological record are extremely important, and these might have even been preferred for hunting. We recovered what may be the oldest intact projectile point from the Eastern Steppe, and a complete bronze arrow that's been hafted with sinew and decorated towards its rear end. It doesn't show super clearly here, with ochre, in fact, where there probably was fletching here. This is radiocarbon dated, again, to the early part of the first millennium BC. Because of the high degree of organic preservation, we're able to dive deeper into how some of these artifacts were constructed by using collagen fingerprinting through a technique called zooms. And in doing so, we found some interesting things, you know, largely that some of these things, like the sinew used to wrap an arrow, might have actually been derived from wild species, even though folks probably would have had access to a number of other domestic taxa alternatives for things like ligaments to construct arrows. We also found some things that were sort of surprising, including what may be large spear or dart shafts here, dated to the period of, you know, the Xiongnu Empire, essentially the late Xiongnu Empire, which probably used in ambush hunting. And then preserved at the top of the ridge on the mountain here, a number of what other researchers have chosen to call scare sticks. These are sort of sharpened natural sticks that were stuck upright along the ridge, and dating to a prolonged period beginning again in the late Bronze Age, probably used as sort of game drive tools to sort of guide the animals as they were being driven up the ice margin to go in a particular desired direction where they could be ambushed by hunters. We also found some occasional items that appear to have been dropped in the snow and don't particularly have a connection to hunting. This is a horsehair rope dated to about 1500 years ago that we're able to do some follow-up analysis now, working with sort of DNA sequencing and such. So what can we learn from all this material now that I'm out of time here? You know, the big picture implications of this work, I think, are quite important. And again, reminding us that this is only a single locality. But what this suggests to us is that some of the iconographic representations we see in Mongolia's early pastoral societies, you know, we bring to mind the deer stone images here, in which wild game figures so prominently, but do not appear in the sort of meager archaeofaunal record that we typically encounter. In fact, that there was a subsistence component to that iconography, right? This is not simply a memory of a previous lifestyle, but that hunting played an important role in these early pastoral societies. And in fact, you know, sometimes Argali sheep are even decorated directly on some of these images. But more importantly, by starting to kind of look at the long-term patterning that we see in these features, some interesting things pop out. And I'm not going to get too far into this because we're still waiting on some collaborators who are able to synthesize this a bit with sort of paleoenvironmental data and do this with a bit more nuance. But here's this kind of summed probability of all the radiocarbon dates on hunting artifacts that we have at this site. And I wanted to draw your attention to how they fit into some of the broader social developments that have been discussed in other talks. These are the periods of what you might consider to be sort of a fluorescence of nomadic polities or empires. And what I begin to notice is that we don't really have, at Sengel at least, evidence of meaningful high altitude hunting activity in these zones during these times. In fact, if anything, it appears that hunting activity sort of peaks in these sort of interim periods. And so, you know, other scholars, it's become kind of a popular theme to point to the role of sort of colder conditions, increased precipitation, and more productive pasture in the formation of sort of these larger pollinators. But what this patterning might start to suggest is that hunting, high altitude hunting of wild game, actually might play sort of the opposite role, acting as an important subsistence fail-safe in periods that might be, more sort of difficult from a pastoral subsistence perspective. That's one way to look at the data. There are other factors that might be considered here. But why is that particularly important? Well, these days in the 21st century, things like poaching, climate change are working in tandem to sort of reduce the presence and the viability of these ice zones in the mountains, reduce their size, reduce the number of big game that are able to use them. And folks, your average herders now, our populations are so low that folks are not able to do the kind of big game hunting that seems to have been a long-term critical factor in nomadic subsistence. And, folks that live in the shadow of Tsengelharchen told us they haven't seen big Argali sheep up there in 50 years, maybe, right? And at the same time, Donald Trump Jr. was up there, doing a sort of trophy hunt. And so the limited opportunities for this big game hunting are sort of are being outsourced, and in doing so, really reducing the viability of mountain pastoralism from this tradition that stretches back centuries or millennia. And I just wanted to finally show here an image of what we see from satellite imagery in terms of the loss of ice cover in this region just over the last 20 years. If you quantify it just by, spatial coverage, that's 30% of the total land area since 2001. And so this is really becoming an urgent issue, both from a pastoral ecological perspective, as well as from a scientific and archaeological cultural heritage perspective. Okay, so I'm over my time and I will wrap it up. And actually we're not doing questions now, so ignore that slide. But thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
All right, thank you so much, Will. It's a really interesting talk with such amazing preservation you were finding there in the mountains. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that and also the relationship to modern issues in these areas during our discussion later. Next up, we have Dr. Alicia Ventresca-Miller, who will be talking on Before the Silk Road, Tracking Domestication and Interactions Across Eurasia.
Yeah, so today my talk is about before the Silk Roads, tracking domesticates and social complexity across Eurasia. So over the past decade, we have started to understand the timing of human movements across the steppe and domesticates that people brought with them. So at broad scales, we sort of have a better idea of when human gene flows occurred, when domesticated ruminants, including sheep, goat, and cattle, were being introduced, when and where horses were domesticated or adopted, and when cultigens were adopted in the steppe. So this is great that we have this sort of new understanding of the moving of domesticates and humans, at least at these vast scales. However, the transmission of people and domesticates is not the story. Instead, we should be focusing on the ways that the adoption of domesticates impacted societies. On a global scale, the spread of farming is often implicated in radical changes to societies, including key social and demographic developments. However, in many regions of the world, the initial adoption of domesticates did not immediately lead to dramatic changes. There were instead slower transformations on centennial or longer timescales. Only recently has new research in the steppe permitted distinctions to be made between the initial spread of livestock and cultigens, their adoption, and when they became intensively managed. Therefore, a focus on detailed analyses of microregions allows for a richer understanding of broader trends. So the rise of social complexity can be linked to the spread of domesticates. After domesticates are introduced, there are at least 3 stages, as we discussed. So the initial spread and potentially the adoption, the growth of knowledge and the growth of dietary diversity, and intensification in management strategies, both for livestock and cultigens, and then potentially surplus and storage, whether this is on the hoof or of grains. So this can lead to population growth, We see the first monumental architecture in many areas after this. We see the growth of social stratification. This is not necessarily linear, but a diverse economy can lead to population growth and drive social change. So today I'll focus on sort of each of these and sort of end up talking about network expansion and urbanization. And really what I'm trying to do is identify multiple trajectories through this process. So again, over the past decade, the scientific revolution in archaeology has really significantly impacted our understanding of Eurasian steppe societies. And much of this work is being done by early career scholars. So I'd really like to thank all of my colleagues and collaborators in Germany, in Kazakhstan, in Mongolia, and Russia, who are working alongside a large group of people to sort of do new research in the region. So first, if we look at the transition from the Neolithic and Aneolithic to the Bronze Age, we're looking at this transition to pastoralism, potentially horse domestication, as well as the movement of populations. So before 4000 BCE, much of the region is inhabited by hunter-gatherers and fishers. Here I highlight groups located near Lake Baikal in Russia, so over here on the right side of the slide. And these people invested greatly in mortuary rituals, whether their social systems are egalitarian, they seem more stratified to me, but they're heavily understudied. This area is kind of unique because it's in the ecosystem of Lake Baikal, and so there are seal available, reindeer, a lot of fish and other aquatic species. And so, you know, we have this sort of experimenting with complexity happening in this early period. Then far to the west, we have the Yamnaya culture. These are pastoral populations. I put them in green. They're buried in mounds with metal artifacts, and you can see some of their artifacts here on the bottom of the slide. And in the middle, we have Botai Tersek cultures, and these are either hunter-gatherers or have early domesticated horses. 99% of animal remains are horses, but it's sort of unclear in this moment if these are being hunted, if they're fully domesticated, if they're partially domesticated, being managed. And unfortunately, I thought Will was going to talk about horses, so I'm not going to discuss that much further, but we can come back to that in the questions. Slightly later in time, we have the Afanasevo culture. We have individuals in Mongolia who are genetically linked to groups from the West. How far west is still a bit of an open question. These are herders that brought along livestock. We have evidence from dairy proteins that have been identified in human dental calculus by 3000 BCE and later. And these proteins include dairy from sheep, goat, and cattle, but not horses initially. And then in the south, we have the earliest domesticated crops being identified, including wheat and millet, both present by as early as 2500 BCE, potentially earlier as well. And this is one of my favorite slides because you really see that these groups are overlapping chronologically, and that there's a huge diversity in economies and social structures, you know, at sort of one time period across the steppe. So I'm going to use this information sort of as a backdrop for us to move into the Middle and Late Bronze Age in the Trans-Urals to sort of look at detailed analyses to lead us in new directions in archaeology. So again, we have some gene flow of humans happening at the dawn of the Bronze Age. Before the Bronze Age, at 3500 BCE, we have hunter-gatherer fisher populations occupying broad portions of the steppe. New populations arrived to the central steppe, first with domesticated ruminants by approximately 3500 BCE. This includes sheep, goats, and cattle. Then later with domesticated horses by about 2100 BCE. So we have approximately 900 years of ruminants in the central steppe near the Urals before the Middle Bronze Age Syntasha developments and before we have very clear evidence for the arrival of the horse. So this is something I think is really important that needs to be talked about a bit more. So why is this background important? Because of the complexity of Syntasha culture, you know, understanding what came before this and what helped to sort of drive these societies towards living in this manner are really important. So first of all, we have large fortified settlements, like at the site of Arkhaim in the Southern Urals, and you can see Arkhaim here. Each one of these boxes here is a house, and this is someone's shoulder. It might even be Brian Hanks. And you can see just how huge these houses are. Populations range between 200 and 700 individuals. This archaeological culture has sort of a moderate size interaction sphere spread across northern Kazakhstan and southern Russia. I say moderate because you'll see soon the Andronova, and then you'll understand what a huge, culture group that is. No cultigens have been recovered during flotation at several of these sites, and isotope analyses demonstrate that these are pastoral societies and that they do not have grains. As you see here, there's evidence for wheeled vehicles, but when we studied human mobility at these sites, what we found is that they're engaging more in terms of a localized interaction sphere. So they're moving in within a localized zone, but not engaging in long distance mobility. Comparatively, for the late Bronze Age Andronova culture, there's a really big shift in settlement to sort of small unfortified settlements that are not very well organized. And you can see this in the bottom right-hand corner. We have populations of less than 100, and most sites had very few, very small populations. There's a huge interaction sphere that encompasses most of Western Siberia with similar motifs on pottery. And so we have this globalization of pottery motifs, but we have local variation in mortuary rituals. Again, the economy is pastoral. There are no grains at these sites, and mobility is localized. There's no really long distance mobility happening. So what was the primary economy of these complex societies? So we do have some horses. The majority of these are recovered from burials rather than settlements. So ruminant livestock were used for about 900 years before horses were adopted. Therefore, it seems that complex societies were built on ruminant pastoralism, while horses performed more of a ritual function or had other uses. So what we did is we wanted to look at different pasture use by different animals. And what we demonstrated was that pasture usage strategies really varied according to different taxa. So in both periods, horses grazed in the open steppe or in well-watered soils, staying well outside of settlements. In the Middle Bronze Age, ruminants had grazed across multiple zones, both near settlements, where pastures were grazed intensively, as well as in non-local pastures. And in the late Bronze Age, what we find is that ruminants grazed on pastures that were not greatly impacted by anthropogenic effects or that were not grazed intensively. So again, in the Middle Bronze Age, I keep going back to that. In the Middle Bronze Age, populations engaged in intensive landscape use around large settlements, as well as extensive landscape use by livestock on a broader spatial scale. And so we have evidence for landscape degradation at some of the Sintashta sites based on changes in vegetation communities and a decrease in biodiversity. And when communities spread out to smaller sites during the Andronova period, the late Bronze Age, they impact the landscape less. So we have sort of a similar gap in the timing of the adoption of livestock and dairying in the Eastern Steppe in Mongolia. A lot of this is the work of Shevin Wilkin. And what Shevin did is she identified through dairy proteins in human dental calculus that first there was ruminant milk, and there's some identified quite early at about 3000 BCE in central Mongolia, and that sheep, goat, and cattle were sort of the mainstay of the economy for 1800 years, and that horse dairying didn't begin till about 1200 BCE. And so that's a rather long time. Even if we identify horse dairying 500 years earlier, we're still looking at a very long time period of ruminant livestock being the mainstay of the economy before horses were introduced. And so there's this sort of similar gap of people depending on ruminant livestock for long periods of time before the horse became important. So if we move into the final Bronze Age, we're looking at evidence now of urbanization, early farmers, and livestock foddering. So what we see at about 1300 BCE is sort of this mosaic of millet across the steppe with considerable regional variation in millet consumption by pastoralists across Eurasia. So millet is here in the red. And so this access to millet is likely due to differences in intensity of cultivation and the degree of local participation in broader networks. So some areas like in central Siberia up here, we have sort of a conservation of pastoralism alongside hunting and gathering and fishing. In the Mongolian steppe in the Trans-Urals in green, we have sustainable pastoralism that continued to be the main subsistence economy. So what's happening at 1300 BCE? Well, we have a shift to externally oriented interactions that facilitated the creation and maintenance of political networks. We have the growth of urban centers and proto-urban centers in pastoral zones. And now we're going to focus in on central Kazakhstan during the final Bronze Age. So the site of Kent is located in a well-watered river valley adjacent to what is called the Hungary steppe. So this is a semi-arid zone of the steppe. Contemporary livestock are grazing in river valleys in the winter and the open steppe in the summer, and they're storing fodder during the modern period. And I have a picture here of some fodder being stored. Kent is an urbanized locale. It had multiple types of structures, including pit houses, so at least 130 pit houses, elevated platforms, and stone structures. And stone structures, it's sort of unclear exactly what they were being used for, but they do seem to have like rooms or some sort of divisions within them. We also have multiple sites located within valleys and at the locations where the valley and the open steppe meet. So we do have this sort of locale of social and economic activity that's happening during this period. So how were large aggregated populations sustained in this region? Sheep at Kent have an inverse relationship between carbon and oxygen. So what we can say about this is that livestock were being herded in the open semi-arid steppe and well-watered valleys during the late spring and summer. Fodder was being cut at the end of summer from natural pastures, and livestock were being foddered in the winter months while living in these sheltered valleys. This close management of sheep at the site of Kent suggests that in semi-arid environments, livestock strategies had to be highly organized. We also modeled oxygen isotope sequences to demonstrate that there were multiple birthing seasons for lambs within a calendar year. So pastoralists were managing sheep so that dairy or other secondary products could be extended over a longer period of time from the spring through the fall. So again, our question remains, like, how are populations being fed and sustained? So one thing that we're finding is that in the semi-arid areas of the steppe, we find some waterways are being altered by dams and stone structures. And you can see a depiction here by Margolin in the 1970s, late 1970s. And this can either be for cultivated crops. It can also be to increase the productivity of pastures. There is evidence for low-level millet consumption at this site, and that's actually some of the earliest for this area in central Kazakhstan. We also have evidence for the emergence of leaders and materialized hierarchies in the mortuary realm. So here in the bottom right, you can see this steppe pyramid with an individual placed in the center, and then a bunch of people sort of buried alongside nearby. So these societies had diverse subsistence economies based on closely managed livestock and cultivation of cultigens, permitting the growth of populations as well as social hierarchies. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through the early and late Iron Ages, just to show like how things kind of change and stay the same in these regions. So in the early Iron Age, we definitely have network expansion. We have evidence of the spread of animal-style motifs, which McFarland talked about a lot today. And we definitely have evidence for long-distance trade that's often translated into humans being on the move. We do have evidence for steep hierarchies emerging in this period with a focus on individual leaders. We have kingdoms being discussed in the Han texts. And we definitely have evidence of sort of peer polity interactions that are happening in this time period. Do we have nomads? Well, in the moment, we don't have very good evidence for direct evidence for long distance mobility in this region or time period. And most of the societies had economies that were based in agro-pastoralism. So this is sort of an area of research that we need to expand on. And so for the late Iron Age, I'm just going to very quickly go through the Xiongnu. So by the late Iron Age, we have this sort of globalization of millet. Millet consumption is almost ubiquitous across Eurasia. And this is during the expansion of the Xiongnu Empire and the beginning of the Silk Road trade routes. So it seems that the Xiongnu Empire was fueled by a combination of millet agriculture and pastoralism. While agropastoralism spreads across the region, there is still a conservation of lifeways in central Siberia that you can see here in this orangey color. And in the Transurals, there's more evidence for this consumption of wheat and barley than there is for millet. It's not that they weren't eating millet, but we just can't detect that isotopically. However, while there seems to be evidence of homogeneity in diet, the globalization of millet consumption is actually masking glocalization processes. So each locale had different systems for farming and livestock management. And finally, I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about the Silk Road. So in the flourishing Silk Road era, networks of exchange over vast zones were solidified. We have good evidence that much of the economic diversity and early networks evident along the Silk Roads were actually formulated during earlier periods. At the height of the Silk Road era, new domesticates were being introduced and traded across this zone, and this was impacting local communities. We need to think critically about the impacts of the transmission of ideas, technologies, and domesticates, as well as the transfer of hidden diseases and microbes. For example, along the frontier of the Yuan dynasty, as part of our project Preserved in the Permafrost, our salvage excavation of looted burials are providing much needed insight into the impacts of trade along these northern routes of the Silk Roads. And as you can see from most Silk Road maps, these northern routes aren't even identified. And so what we've been finding, we're working with Jamsaranjab Bayersachen and the National Museum of Mongolia, and as well as Nomad Science. And what we're finding are silks, ceramics, and even dairy among these remains that are being actively looted in the region. And our analyses are just now beginning to shed light on the economies, diets, and diseases of the frontier elites in this microregion. Thus, I want to end on a note that we need to have a continued dialogue between detailed studies and broad-scale changes in order to understand these sort of multiple trajectories of economic and social change in Eurasia. So I'd like to thank all of my colleagues for their help with this research and for the support and funding provided. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you so much. And I really liked how you ended it there, talking about how we need these detailed studies to go along to understand these broader pictures. And I think that's exactly what we're going to hear about as well in our final talk of the day, which is from Dr. Michael Ferchetti, with a talk entitled Behind Genetics, Ancestries of Central Eurasia in Light of New Social Models.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm really delighted to see everybody here addressing some of these important issues. I'm also quite sad that we weren't able to meet in person as I was looking forward to some time in California. But nevertheless, I think it's 60 degrees here in Missouri. So maybe we've exchanged our weather patterns or something. I'm going to do my very, very best to stay within my 20 minutes with the hopes that we can delve into some topics and conversation points, especially given the two wonderful talks that preceded mine. I know I have a lot of questions both for Will and Alicia as to how to reconcile some of the different regional issues that we'll be discussing. But my focal point today is going to basically be how do we understand the genetic record that we currently have available in light of both the existing archaeological evidence, some of which was just previously described here by Alicia very well, and other evidence that maybe hasn't been brought to light just yet. And then in terms of the way we think about complexity and the way we think about social models as they pertain to the Eurasian steppe in particular and different environments. So I want to start with this image or this study that has been referenced a few times here. I know it was brought up earlier by James and recently just in the last talk. The study by Damgard et al. Was a really pioneering study in the sense that it tried to take on a very broad chronological and regional array of data. And in doing so, kind of basically produced these sort of maps of sort of sweeping arrows of events and these kinds of things, which from a genetics perspective is wonderful because it did introduce quite a lot of genomic information. From an archaeological perspective, probably did more damage than it did good. And I say that with all due respect to the authors of the article, but with 137 genomes across, what appears to be roughly 3,000 or 4,000 years, it basically meant that you were selecting one individual from every city and then asking how these cities were interacted. If you were doing that in America, I mean, the Afanasyevo sample was less than a handful, and so this study was pioneering in its publication, in part because it sparked later studies. And so, although I won't be discussing that particular study, I will be discussing a study that I was involved with, which tried to remedy this issue of a sample size. And we had the good fortune of being able to include this study within the analytics of the additional samples that we were able to collect. And I'm going to get to that at the end of my talk. Rather than sort of forecasting the genetics, I want to first forecast the archaeology and then come back to the genetics at the end. And so I just put this out here as a prompt and as a caution, in the sense that when we see these maps with sort of, specific, arrows sweeping across the step A in any particular direction, we have to realize that there's a lot more going on. And I think that some of the recent publications, including the one that just came out by Zhang et al., where a number of the participants here are involved, represent a real step in the right direction and a better direction than sort of these broad initial studies that basically set the benchmark for what we were doing in genomics. For the scope of this talk, I want to actually back up to one of the maps that has been highly influential in my own work, and probably, if anything, was the most influential discovery I've ever made in terms of previous research. Meaning that, when I stumbled upon this map in a publication by Abramzanov, it's a tongue twister, Abramzanov, it really struck me as something that was very discordant with the previous map, right? This is a map of mobility patterns collected according to ethnographic evidence, in which, if you compare the vectors of mobility, summer to winter, summer being northern, winter being southern, across the majority of the Eurasian steppe, you see populations actually moving directly north and south, which makes total ecological sense given the kinds of factors that condition pastoral mobility. The only area where you see really any east to west movements, or particularly any kind of shorter east or west movements, is along the mountain ranges, which, as was mentioned earlier by Will, mountains represent kind of a unique environment in some way or another. And it was this focus of this kind of corridor, if you will, that even in the earliest stages of my career drew me to try to understand why this was a different area and whether it was a significant one in terms of east to west interaction. And it was, in fact, this kind of area right here. I'll use Will's technique here. This zone here in the southeastern Kazakhstan, where I really noticed this east to west kind of movement that was an ecological movement of very, very short distances, that sparked me to try to understand how this corridor, if you will, might have taken shape. And it was in that kind of vein that my very, very first presentation, which was made in the year 2000, prior to really any of the modern analysis that Alicia was just referring to, had taken place, dove directly into some of these issues. And I was, very much in a way asking a lot of the same questions. It was about, what was this shift from Neolithic hunting and limited domestication to a predominantly agro-pastoral form of production? How did this occur? And this was, of course, at a time when we had very little evidence for any kind of farming, but nevertheless, the kind of general sense that there should be some combination between let's say herd-dominant economies and those that also incorporated farming. And at the same time, or as early as 2002, when I first published this article, I was already thinking about the way in which these foothill zones created corridors of interaction. And really, when I say a substantivist line of inquiry, what I was trying to understand was, what is the evidence that we have? And the answer was basically very little at that time. This led me, of course, to my PhD research, and I want to go very, very briefly. It's something I haven't talked about for decades, and probably many of you have never even seen me talk about it, just given the nature of the field, the movement of the field. But this was the initial survey, right? This was the initial, whatever, 100 some odd sites that led to so many different kinds of discoveries, specifically those at the site of Big Gosh. And this settlement survey was as important for understanding the archaeology as it was for understanding mobility. And it was these sites that, and the ethnographic work that was done alongside them, that helped me to shape and understand exactly how these east to west, up and down high altitude transhumance movements, or not even so much high altitude in this case, medium altitudes, functioned, and how that served to link populations in forms of networks. And here, this is a map I've used for decades, literally, in which you see how these networks could take shape as communities move just simply 5 to 10 kilometers up to the highlands of their local mountain ranges to take advantage of rich pastures. Modeling this, as I did back in my PhD, and ultimately as it was published in 2006, was sort of an effort to understand the variability in the kinds of movements that each population or each community, each settlement community, who ultimately would have been part of a broader regional or sub-regional community, just to see the variation in mobility that they might have actually employed. And these distances, of course, are all less than 20 kilometers. I mean, for scale purposes, you can see here this is about 5K. So a movement pattern in this zone would have been no more than a 10 kilometer or 15 kilometer round trip if you were to take it over a number of seasons. So I fully agree with the early assessment, the earlier comments by Alicia that especially in the early stages, but probably throughout most of the archaeological Bronze Age archaeological record, mobility patterns in this area were relatively short distance. And this then drew me into to question some of the broader migration models that we had been using to understand social change and material change. Of course, for those of you who are aware, this is exactly the same set of models that were then deployed at a much wider range. And I think it's interesting to think that when you take a localized model of how individuals operate in a very specific territory, and this may include hunting forays and other kinds of things, and then you extrapolate it across sort of the entirety of the Asian highlands, you end up producing what in the end is essentially the highest resolution map of the Silk Road that we have. And it also begs us to question whether what we think of as the Silk Road as some kind of like historical launch. I've heard people throughout this seminar talk about whether or not it's premature to say the word Silk Road. Well, the Silk Road isn't the thing, right? The Silk Road is something that was coined in the 19th century. And so when we think about the networks in the trade, as Brian's paper and many others have shown, these are realities that have taken place for millennia. And so whether we call it the Silk Road or anything else, we can already begin to see the geographic architecture, the geographic pathwork that underlies a lot of these community interactions. Which of course brings us to some of the locations along the site, along the roads. And I highlight this one only because, again, I think many people probably haven't seen the dramatic splendor of the site of Big Gosh, which is sort of a relatively humble site tucked into the mountains of Kazakhstan. But this site kind of made a lot of important contributions to our understanding of the economy and mobility patterns of mountain Eurasia. In particular, it offered us a very high resolution image of the kinds of domestication patterns and the kinds of animal usage that early pastoralists in at least the southeastern region of Kazakhstan and the mountain zone embarked upon. And so, for example, here we were able to parse out, along with the brilliant archaeofaunal work of Norbert Benecke, parse out the early Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age, Iron Age, medieval, and up to almost a historic period continuity in herding patterns. And I want to point out, just according to just to articulate with a few things that Will was saying, 20%. I don't show this here, but of the 20% of the animals here that are so this is all the domestic animals. There's another graphic that shows basically of all of the percentages of animals available, over 5 to 10% are actually hunted animals. So hunting plays a massive role throughout this sequence, which is of course not highlighted in a graph like this, but I have highlighted it in other areas. And I would encourage, for comparative sense, I would take a look at this oldie but goodie that's in there that talks a little bit about the function of hunting amongst early pastoralist communities. Looking at the animals alone, which is pretty much all we had up until about 2010, I began to think differently about how we parsed out the Western, Central, and of course there's a mistake here in terms of my own map. I left it as it was published, but Eastern Steppe really meant to sort of extend out into Mongolia. This is kind of just a borderline that I arbitrarily drew, if you really want to know. It probably should start really more over here, but nevertheless, parsing out the differentiation between what I defined as sort of this mountain zone, the central steppe, which I saw as an area defined by horses and by early Botai type societies, and the Western steppe. And looking at this from a chronological perspective in the early Bronze Age, I saw really different trends. And what you can see here, again, is a comparative map of Western, Central, and Eastern steppe, or let's say Eastern steppe and IMAC, Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor communities, which show a prevalence of sheep and goat moving towards the middle, a dominance of horses in the central region, and then a dominance of cattle in the Western region. And this research has been borne out and done much more accurately by other scientists like Robin Bendry and others who've actually calculated this according to many more sites. But around 2009, when I was writing this article, there wasn't that many available data sets that were reliable. And so this was sort of an assessment of again, drawing big lines and big arrows between things that didn't have a lot of evidence behind it, which drove me, of course, to do more work. It also helped me to formulate this concept that these mountains were more than just a place that pastoralists could interact, but that it was also a unique environment for developing a range of economic and other interactions. So this is really where I think, for me, building out a concept of not just how animals spread or how crops eventually spread, it was really about building out a broader understanding of how populations interact and how mountains shape those interactions in particular ways. And I just, for the argument's sake, I just traced out some of the intellectual history of my own, because it's something that we always kind of forget as kind of how we come through these ideas over the decades. And this was sort of my own history of kind of thinking about this question of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor. Today, of course, studies of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor have become quite abundant. And then there's a number of individuals in the audience I know, as well as others who are in, across the world, who have taken on this concept to try to understand not only this, or particularly the spread of crops, but also the spread of other things. And so I'm thinking, of the wonderful work being done in Kyrgyzstan now by Gidra and her team. The work that's been done out here in the Murghab Delta, which has some articulation with the IMAC, recent work in Kashmir by Alison Betts and her colleagues, as well as sites like Adan Chalu in northwest China in the Jungar Basin, and of course sites here in the northern regions, which, for example, like Tongtian Cave, which all show very, very clear communication and interaction throughout this mountain region. And just to point out where Will was talking about, it's just off here to the edge of this map, basically, in these zones over here. And so we're talking about areas that would have been ecologically tied into a similar set of regional trends. I'll also just point out this zone here called the Chimorchek or Kiermachek culture region. I'll talk about it later in the genetics. And I just want to show you the proximity of some of these areas to the sites that I want to now focus on, which are Dali and Tasbas. The work that I did has been pretty focused in a particular pocket of the IMAC, of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor. I talked to you already a little bit about the work from Bigash, but since 2010, we began intensively working further up the valleys at slightly higher elevations at two sites, Dali and Tasbas. And just to quickly summarize their contributions to the debates, aside from the work that we had done at Bigash, which showed some of the earliest known evidence for actual grains, the work at Tasbas kind of locked in this process as something that had started taking place quite early in the third millennium. The dates of the seeds at Tasbas still remain as some of the earliest known wheat grains, and amongst the earliest barley grains as well. And so we're looking at basically a 3000 BC, 3100, whatever kind of chronological window for the spread of domesticated grains northward from Southwest Asia, as well as westward from East Asia, because of course we have the mixture of broomcorn millet from China as well as Southwest Asian domesticates. And it was these two sites of Bigash and Tasbas that really locked in their ritual use and the capacity for these grains to not only be seen as sort of bread wheats and things that you use to make food, but also to have them be part and parcel of a ritual or ideological economy. That was something that we haven't talked much about in terms of outside of semiotics. So when we think about the sort of mapping of this sort of Inner-Asian mountain corridor, the initial sort of conceptualization of it was, Southwest Asian grains and domesticates moving towards the east, and vice versa, East Asian domesticates moving towards the west. But we now know much more than just the wheat, barley, and millet. We now know a lot also about the animals. And the picture of the animals that Alicia showed, I have to say I disagree with a little bit, because we know about the animals, or we know about some of the genetics behind now animals in the Altai, and it shows some interesting results. And for that, we have to go to the site of Dali. The site of Dali is located, as you can see here, kind of right in the middle of the corridor, right very close to Tasbas and Bigash. And the site itself is a very early site, just like Tasbas. It dates to the early 3rd millennium. It has sort of globular, egg-shaped, incised pottery, like we see in the Altai region, and like we see amongst some of the communities of the Southern Altai. As well, we also were fortunate to find a human temporal bone in the actual settlement area, a sort of displaced human skull fragment, which allowed us to gain genomics from this site. So it actually represents one of the few early Bronze Age genomic records that we have from anywhere in this region. And so it's a key sample, and one that actually I'll talk about more as we go forward. So this is sort of a brief overview of the site. You have people living in pit house structures. So this early Bronze Age phase is very much a continuity from the Neolithic period, where you have communities, practicing hunting. And here again, we have, again, to come back to Will's point, we have evidence for Argali sheep, and we have evidence for other major large fauna in the site faunal assemblage. And so, this is a place where a lot of those issues between the adoption of pastoralism and the integration of hunting and other mechanisms, including agriculture, becomes a really key question. First, if we look at the genetics of the animals from there, and we compare, say, for example, an E-Neolithic, in this case, Afanasyevo site of Nizhnaya Soru, this is the work of Taylor Hermes, by the way, along with Dali, you see an exact genetic match between their sheep and goats. So it looks like the sheep and in this case, the Ovis aries, the sheep, are actually Near East, they're of a Near Eastern genetic origin. So we have the understanding that the origin of at least some of the sheep amongst the Afanasyevo sites, like the ones at Nizhnaya Soru, can be traced to a Near Eastern origin and not necessarily to a Western Eurasian origin, which would have had a different set of genetic admixtures that do not represent in these particular genetic signatures. Same thing can be said for other things like the Capra. And so we see these relationships between Bigash, Dali, and the sites of the IMAC and the Northern IMAC, representative here as a sort of a central point as these communities illustrate similarities in their obtainment, or let's say the acquisition of these certain domesticated caprids. Interestingly enough, it's not surprising then that we also see a simultaneous distribution of grains. And at Dali, we have the problem of we didn't recover any actual physical grains. However, we did have the good fortune of being able to recover isotopic evidence from the animal bones at Dali, Bigash, and in some cases Tasbas, to show some interesting patterns of foddering. And so this graphic, again, from the work of Taylor Hermes, shows some interesting trends, specifically a rise in C4 crops during summer months. And so you can see here, as this graphic shows, the early Bronze Age samples, in this case from Dali and Tasbas. As you enter into the winter, the relative C4 component of the diet increases as opposed to the annual rounds of other animals, in this case, during the late Bronze Age. And so the explanation between sheep of the early and middle Bronze Age versus sheep of the other periods versus cattle is actually quite different. And what you end up seeing is basically an increase in percentages of foddering according to the kind of animals that people were keeping. So while on the one hand, we can look at the kinds of mobility patterns of the region as broadly transhumant, we also have to recognize that for different animals, there were different mobility patterns. For example, the cattle appear to not have been foddered very heavily, at least in the early Bronze Age phase, whereas sheep and goat would have been foddered much more heavily during winter months. So there's actually different kinds of trajectories, and these things change as you move from the early Bronze Age into the late Bronze Age in terms of their percentages, which is what is represented by these lower graphs here. Again, you can see with the cattle, very little difference between early, middle, and late, whereas the differences between early, middle, and late treatments here at Bigash versus Dali there's significant, up to 5 to 10% change in each time period, according to the level of fodder that was used during winter months. I want to say a few more words about the work that Alicia has done, because there's some really interesting evidence here for the spread of these domesticated grains moving westward across Eurasia. If you compare the graphs, and this is, I made a mark here at like -17, which is kind of the mark for a pronounced C4 component to the diet. As she pointed out, you don't see a massive pivot towards these heavily integrated millet diets until sometime in the middle part of the second millennium BC. So here around 1300 in central Kazakhstan, or 1600 in southeastern Kazakhstan. However, if we compare, for example, the animal bones from sites like Bigash and Dali, we see actually a considerable amount of C4 being integrated into the animal diets. So that's an interesting sort of caveat to sort of the spread. This early phase may have actually been more about feeding animals than it was about feeding humans. So this is a slide that very much summarizes what I think Alicia did fairly well, which is to sort of illustrate all the different regional diversity. And I think I'll just skip ahead because that's more or less the same message. So that then brings us to these genetic things. And I'll wrap this up in less than 5 minutes, I promise. The genetic record here is one that is, pretty impressive. We now, in this article that we published in 2019, we were able to sort of pull together over 500 new samples from across the Eurasian steppe, and yet we still end up producing these maps with vast arrows that seemingly don't explain what's going on. So, given what we now know from the archaeological record, what can we say about this genetic record? Well, first and foremost, we have to differentiate between the Yamnaya migration, which was, I think, an episodic migration that actually had very little to do with the genetic substrate of the Eurasian steppe, with what we understand to be basically a primordial genetic signature. And so if you look here along the Inner-Asian Mountain Corridor, we see a really nice deviation, or a nice separation between northern communities like those at Dali, and southern communities like those here at Sarazm and others, who kind of have inverted ancestry percentages. And this extends a little bit into the central steppe as well, but largely across the steppe, with the exception of the Afanasyevo, you see a broadly indigenous community, if you will, that's probably derived from the Neolithic substrate. Likewise, we can see that here along different clines. And I just want to point out that if we compare, for example, the site of Dali with some newly published work by our colleagues here, Jiang et al. And other authors, the Chimorchek sites, which are of Western Altaic origin, actually match almost identically with those of Dali. So we actually see a broader sense for how these communities are laid out. And of course, here again, you see these broadly Neolithic substrates represented in the pre-Bronze Age and early Bronze Age communities. Just chronologically, you can see that Dali, Bigash, Afanasyevo, and Okuniev overlap. By the time you get to the late Bronze Age, it gets way more complicated. And here again, it's sort of a mess. If you look at southern sites along the IMAC, they cluster very nicely genetically with Central Eurasian, Central Steppe communities. And likewise, Central Steppe and northern IMAC communities fall kind of likewise along that line. And BMAC sites can also be found in some cases quite far north on the PCA. So you end up kind of getting this distribution where you have broad regional trends, but within each of these regional trends, you get outliers and communities who are kind of in a way representative of some genetic ancestry that doesn't quite match their regional home. This all speaks then to something about interaction. I think this is really the take-home message here. And I want to sort of introduce this idea of participation, which we write about in our article on Dali, which is soon to be published, and talk about the way in which institutions then are transmitted and redefined through this act of participation. And this can be in the realm of ideology, political organization, economy, technology. And what we are ultimately talking about is the transfer of physical, i.e. genetic, material, ceramic, metal, et cetera, or symbolic manifestation of institutional prototypes. So whatever institutional prototype it may be, how to bury a body, how to build your house, how to effectively decorate or adorn oneself. These are all examples of how different communities participate with one another to generate new cultural forms. And it's this kind of pattern that ultimately leads, I think, to some pan-Eurasian phenomena, whether it be burial styles in the Bronze Age or potentially even animal style art in the Iron Age. It's this act of participating in cross-regional interactions that I think leads to this kind of complexity. I won't say more about this slide because you've seen it before, but I want to end with this slide here, which is genetically, this plays out as well. For each of the clusters of samples that we have, in this case, this is the BMAC cluster, we have a whole variety of outliers. And these outliers are the result of larger sample sizes. So by sampling each of these regions, in this case, the Gonur BMAC region, more heavily, we were able to find large numbers of outliers, people whose genetic codes show that they are living, in a sense, outside of their home regional genetic sort of, core. And likewise, when we go to steppe sites, these are mostly across the Central Eurasian steppe zone, we see BMAC individuals living there. We see central steppe people living in the Western steppe, et cetera, et cetera. So there's actually quite a lot of human interaction. And those arrows that show the sort of westward and eastward movements are kind of overstating, I think, a much more complex set of interactions. And it's with that I want to end, and I'm sorry for going over a few minutes.
So thank you so much to all of our speakers. These were some really interesting talks, and from somebody who has really been working primarily in China, and is on the other side of the mountains, on the other side of the border, and has really had my head stuck in the Chinese literature. It's been great to see all the progress that's been made on different topics across Central Asia, and especially these are really giving me a lot to think about in regards to my own research that's dealing with a lot of similar issues, just in a slightly different geographic location. So I'll try to keep my comments really short, since I know we want as much time as possible for group discussion. But I'll just go through the talks individually first, and then provide a couple of comments at the end on, I think, themes that really were present in all of them. So turning first to Will's talk, I really like the focus on multispectral diets. So talking about pastoralism as not being necessarily the only thing that people were relying on, but also potentially big game hunting or other strategies as well. And I think this should remind us all to really think about the variety of strategies that people used in the past in the sites and societies that we're investigating, not just herding or not just farming, but also hunting, fishing, gathering, gardening, all of these different subsistence strategies that were often used in sort of a piecemeal fashion in many places. Now, of course, we saw some sites that Alicia presented where you don't see any grain whatsoever, so that's not necessarily always the case, but something that I was really thinking about in regards to the sites that I'm looking at. And I also like that you were talking about not just the subsistence focus of hunting, but how there can also be some potentially non-subsistence aspects of these activities as well. So for example, the ritual nature of hunts or community building that could be taking place as far as hunting goes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my final comments at the end. And I also really love that you're looking where it seems like not many other archaeologists have necessarily looked for evidence. I don't know how true this is in Mongolia, if there's really been a whole lot of archaeology done in these glacial areas, which seem like quite a challenging environment to work in. And you're finding this really amazing preservation there. So it was incredible to see those whole organic arrowheads and scare sticks and things like that you were recovering. And it really lets us get at a lot of aspects of material culture that are otherwise unobtainable, at least in the areas that I work in. I'm thinking about, we never find wood. We never would find a horsehair rope or anything like that. And I'm thinking, maybe I should go find some mountain zones near where I'm working to see if I can come up with any of this material, because it would be so amazingly informative. The other thing I was hoping that you can talk a little bit more about in the last part, Will, is the sort of physical issues with doing field work in these environments. So you're talking about hiking 4 hours up and 4 hours back and things like that to get to that. So for people who are interested in doing field work in these really tough environments, sort of what advice you can give us or what sort of challenges that you ran into that might be applicable to people working in these environments in other areas. And then I'd be curious if you could also talk a little more in the comments section about maybe other roles that you would see big game hunting playing. So can we think about it, like I mentioned earlier, in ways that, these hunts might be as much symbolic as they were for subsistence? Or do you really think that subsistence was like the main core of why people were doing this? So I'd be interested to hear more about that as well. And then in your last comment, talking about how we see more hunting, or how at least you see more archaeological evidence of these zones when otherwise you don't really see these sort of big empires like the Xiongnu or the Mongols or things like that. And I was curious, because you mentioned, maybe people were relying more on hunting for subsistence in these non-empire periods. And I was wondering if people might have also been relying more on hunting as a way to build connections between groups and to sort of keep social cohesion in these times when there isn't necessarily larger sort of empire-like social formations going on. So I'll be curious to hear more what you have to say about that, but thanks for the super interesting talk. For Alicia's talk, I really liked how you...
Save the response until you've done all your outlines then?
Yeah, I think that would, if that's okay.
Okay, I'll just make some notes then so I don't...
No worries. For Alicia's talk, I really liked your focus that you weren't necessarily focusing like we see, at least so much in the Chinese literature, on people talking about, the earliest instances of wheat or the earliest horses or things like that, but then often not discussing the sort of whole processes that go behind the adoption of these new technologies, these new domesticates in their integration into society. So I really liked how you were focusing on how these domesticates and technologies fit into overall society and were integrated slowly over time. And especially like you were talking about how you see ruminant herding, and then not till 900 years later do you see horses, is really, I think, challenging this idea that should be challenged of all these herders are on horseback constantly riding around and moving huge distances, that's really not the case that we see. And I also really appreciated your focus on multiple types of data. So clearly you're an expert in isotopes, but you're also considering plant remains and site locations and landscape modification. So it was really great to see you bringing all of those different data sets together to make your points. And looking at these changes over a really long period of time and really long and really geographic location made me think about, often we're just looking at least in China, looking at individual cultures that sort of are there and then disappear. And instead we can really see through your work, these sort of not just cultures as static entities, but these wider flows and movements of people and traditions and subsistence strategies over time, over huge geographic locations as well. And so some questions that I had regarding your talk, I was really curious in what you think about early horse use, since I know you mentioned it potentially being horses serving more as a ritual animal and being involved in ritual function as compared to subsistence. But I was curious how you're envisioning horses for other needs in society. So things like maybe other aspects of subsistence, for example, hunting on horseback or using horses to herd animals or using them for transportation or things like that. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think about these sort of other uses or other roles that horses might have been playing in society. Or other aspects of subsistence that they might have been contributing to. And then I also love to really hear more about why you think new domesticates were adopted in the first place in many of these societies. So like why ruminants were taken up as part of a subsistence strategy, or why millet farming became so dominant later on in time. Because these are really issues that I'm struggling with in my own work, is I also see ruminants being introduced, and then in the same way in China, horses only coming in much later. Or we see obviously coming in the other direction, instead of millet, we see wheat and barley coming in and people adopting those and adapting those. And I'm always struggling with the question as to why they were taking up these new crops, these new technologies. And in some cases they weren't, some cases they were rejecting them. So something that I've been thinking about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too. Michael, for your talk, so I read the papers in the reverse of how you presented them. So Michael kindly provided me with a couple of papers beforehand, and I read the DNA study first and was thinking, this is an amazing collaboration. This is giving us great insight into population movements. But after reading that paper, my thought was, man, now we really need to think more about why these movements took place, the impact they had on local societies, how they contributed to new forms of social and political organization. And then I read your second paper and I'm like, yes, that's exactly what he's doing. So it was really great to see that. And I was really interested in what you mentioned at the end of these institutional prototypes. So thinking about how people that have different, to us looking from modern times, different DNA, so coming from different genetic backgrounds, and thinking about on the ground, how were these people actually being integrated into each other's societies? How were they interacting with each other? And so, how were they groups interacting? How were they mediating these interactions with people from different genetic and potentially different cultural backgrounds? How are they accepting new people into these groups where you see these samples of skeletons where they have all sorts of different DNA? And so how were people, what mechanisms there were there for people actually being integrated into each other's societies? And I was also curious, you didn't mention this as much in the talk, but I noticed in one of the papers that I was reading that several of these sites you looked at were occupied sort of repeatedly with breaks in them. And I was really curious what you thought about why people were coming back to these same spots on the landscape. Was it because they were maybe particularly favorable for pastoralism or for farming or for reasons like subsistence reasons? Or was there some sort of like institutional or societal memory of these spots and of their potentially ancestors occupying these places? Because obviously on the ground, you know, people in the past are seeing archaeological remains. They're seeing remains left over from past societies. And, you know, what role is that playing in sort of constructing identity and memory and history from people living repeatedly in these same locations? So thank you so much for all of these amazing talks. Just to think about them in general, I'll try to wrap up quickly here. So looking at the talks as a group, I was really struck by how they all related to this overall theme of mobility. And it really got me thinking about why people choose to be mobile. And so often we're thinking about subsistence, so mobile herding strategies and things like that. But we saw that that's not always the case. And as Alicia demonstrated, it's really not the case for early herders of ruminants who didn't necessarily move that far. And so I like that each of these talks provided important insights into these questions, looking at DNA evidence and isotopic studies and other evidence. And I also really liked how you start to address the why questions of this, of why people were moving around. And for Will's talk, I was really thinking about, you know, who is engaging in this big game hunting? Are these local groups who are residing nearby these mountains who are engaging in this hunting? Are they groups that were moving around the landscape and maybe multiple groups had access to these areas? Was hunting a strategy that might have brought groups together to build relationships while also providing for subsistence? So could hunts be more about relationship building or building political connections? And Michael's talk also really made me think about the role of history in influencing mobility. So like I was just mentioning, you know, how did people in Eurasia consider their own histories? What did they think about when they were living on top of sites that have been occupied for hundreds of years? What did they think about when they were moving across the landscape and seeing Kyrgyzstars and deer stones and other monuments? What sort of connection did they have with that? And we can also think about, you know, why are these groups returning to the same locations? Are they, like going there for practical concerns, or are there connections with the ancestors or with the past that's helping shape real or imagined identities or connections between groups that are helping to integrate people from multiple cultural backgrounds? And let's see, my last note was that we can also, of course, think about mobility as part of subsistence. And a lot of the patterns that Alicia mentioned, I'm really seeing mirrored in my work in Northwestern China, where we have sheep and goats introduced hundreds and hundreds of years before we see horses coming in, and only this very gradual shift in lifestyles. So it's clearly not necessarily that subsistence practices themselves that drive this movement towards increased mobility in many cases. So trying to think about what are all the other possibilities that might have been making people choose a more mobile lifestyle on the steppe. And so thank you all so much. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion and questions from both our audience members and from you all. So I guess we can have maybe each of you respond in turn and then have a group discussion after that.
Okay, well, in that case, I guess I'll be the first turn. So I really appreciate those very sort of comprehensive and nuanced thoughts on a pretty diverse set of talks. I'll try to just touch on my reaction to some of the things you brought up about my work, and using all of the self-restraint that I can, will not answer anything about horses because they're not directed at me. Although if there's time later, maybe I'll chime in. So in terms of the logistics of field work, you know, I think, you know, we learned some hard lessons about why it is that people don't do a lot of mountain ice patch archaeology in Central Asia. I mean, the mix of the climate and the altitude and the logistics, it's exceedingly difficult. And like I said, I mean, I brought a team of like tried and true field hands, and we lost like half of our people, basically, of an already small team, just trying to get up to the site. And some people got ill in a relatively serious way. So logistically, it's sort of a nightmare, but the payoff is extremely high. And what we're trying to do, I think, you know, with the journal Glacial Archaeology, is sort of encourage people in mountain zones of these areas where the archaeological record is missing a lot of certain kinds of things, you know, organic things, non-funerary things. I mean, that's true of almost everywhere you look in vast swaths of interior Eurasia. So I think there's a high potential for this sort of work in almost anywhere. And, you know, the logistics aren't easy, but it's also, it amounts in many ways just to survey. So, you know, also it can be done economically as well. And so I think there's hopefully there's a bright future for this sort of thing. And I would encourage anybody who's interested in this kind of project to definitely do it and, you know, reach out and connect or what have you. In terms of your comments about hunting, and I think there's a lot to them. I mean, we saw through some of the things about animal style art, just how deep rooted some of this wild game, wild animal imagery is in a lot of steppe identity. I mean, you're not always seeing these, you know, a sheep or whatever as the key icon. And obviously, you know, I spend most of my time looking at things like deer stones, and that's always been an interesting disjunct where it's like, where are the deer? You know, we have horses and sometimes, you know, sheep and goat and cattle, but I think what we're seeing is that they're definitely, it's not purely conceptual, and that there's very important, that cultural role of the iconography was paired to a cultural role for the hunt. And, you know, we're just starting to piece together what was hunting looking like in Western Mongolia in the Bronze Age, but some of the things that immediately jump out, the kind of hunt that we're seeing in the, like at Tsingel, it's almost certainly a communal hunt, right? In the sense that it would have been a game drive probably. And so it would require, you know, some amount of driving and another party, you know, laying in ambush. And it's difficult to assess exactly what the scale is, but almost certainly a sort of a social participatory element to that. And, you know, so it will be interesting to think about, you know, what are the broader implications? In order to address that, we may have to have a bigger and better resolution sort of record of this stuff and how it relates to these other social phenomena. When I've talked about this before, some people have pointed out, for example, that in these periods of like nomadic empire expansion, you actually might have had major demographic changes locally back at home, right? I mean, are men going abroad? And I mean, you look at the way that some of the genomic impact of these expansions manifests elsewhere, and it's like, look at all these Y chromosomes that come in, right? Well, back home, there might have been similar processes at play, and it might have affected, you know, is hunting a male behavior? It might have affected that. If it's not a male behavior, right, then that's in itself a fascinating question. So there's a lot of stuff to engage with deeper here, and in terms of the social and cultural role that hunting played. And I think, you know, ultimately we can't address many or most of these questions with what we know now, but it is nice to know that that information is potentially out there, and that we continue to look at these things, we may get more clues.
That's great. Thank you so much. And it sounds like, yeah, no shortage of promising future research to be done in those areas. So I'm looking forward to seeing your future results. All right, Alicia.
Like, I just wanted to say to Will, like, also when I saw you put that graph up of, you know, when people were engaging in more hunting, you know, generally, I was also thinking about like sort of dispersal. So in maybe some of the empire periods or earlier periods when people are living in larger settlements or larger sites, and then they're dispersing on the landscape, you know, then maybe they're also doing more hunting. So I think that's super interesting, you know, to think about like how people are using landscape differently based on political change.
Yeah,
you know?
I think it could be really cool to keep exploring. So
yeah. In terms of horses, it's like not my specialty. I think so. Like Will and I shared an office, and we did talk about horses a lot. And I feel like maybe some of my like discussion is like focusing more on ruminants is sort of like our little, you know, back and forth, because like I really think ruminants for me are extremely important. You know, the horse, when it comes in, it really does change things drastically, but it's almost like now we need to go back and be like, okay, if we don't have horses and all the ruminants coming at the same time or within 100 years of each other, if we have sort of a longer time span, then what does that mean about social complexity, about demographic growth, about population changes, and like, you know, how are ruminants really changing the landscape, you know, over time? So yeah, I'm not going to talk about horses. Will can talk. I would love for Will to, like, you know, take that question when I'm done.
I'd love to hear about ruminants too.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, why were domesticates initially being adopted? Yeah, that's a really interesting question that I'm not sure we can always get at. It's clear that sort of in the beginning we have this like herder, like humans and animals coming together in sorts of all different kinds of configurations. And I think that sort of is like a trickle through time of like people coming in potentially from different directions in different locales. And, you know, we're starting to see some evidence that when domesticates come in, they're not being accepted by everyone. They're being rejected by some communities, and that, so in the Urals, we have more wheat and barley being consumed than millet. And like, what does that mean for the Urals? And so that sort of takes me back to what Catherine McFarland was talking about, which is like sort of these little micro regions that we see in the early Iron Age. And like, do we also have those deeper in the past? And I think that we actually do. We have some, like, even within this huge Andronova structure, we have these smaller groups that Kuzmina talked about. And so I think we need to think on a local level a little bit more about why each group was adopting or not, and then how are they managing it, because that's extremely diverse. So we can talk about the mountain corridors, that's great, but in terms of the steppe, we have totally different things happening. And so, like, I think we can all kind of agree that, like, these detailed studies that people are doing now are really not the more important, but are very important for understanding these broader trends. And so, you know, I think that, you know, the more people we can get to do detailed studies, whether it's, you know, even if it's just zooms and Zoark, we don't have enough of that, at least in Kazakhstan. So.
Thank you so much. And I can completely relate, because we're seeing some similar trends in northwestern China, whereas what was once imagined as large cultural groups, we're now, you know, getting really detailed information from sort of sub-communities of these groups. And so, you know what, they don't really follow the patterns that we were getting from these overall groups. So really seeing people making much more intentional and localized choices about what they're adopting or not adopting, what they experiment for a while and then reject. So for example, at one of my sites, it seems like they got wheat and barley, and then they decided they didn't really like barley, but they kept the wheat for a while, and then later on barley comes back in. So yeah, really interesting to sort of get this more granular information on how people are adopting and adapting these different technologies and domesticates in different places. And yeah, I can't wait to see more work being done in each of these regions so we can get a better idea of these more localized trends. So thank you so much. And Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I totally agree with Alicia's comments on there. I mean, I think that the closer we can get down to localized levels, the more you realize. And I wrote a paper like 10 years ago or 15 years ago called Differentiated Landscapes. And it was really all about this exact point, right? And it was basically like every one of these locations, even if you just compared Bigash and Tasbas, like, which are only 300 miles away from each other or less, 200 kilometers away from each other, they're really different, right? They're different in their, we have a paper coming out soon looking at their, for example, their networks of ore acquisitions for metal ores, completely different networks, like based on the actual ore compositions, right? I mean, vastly different networks. One's getting it from Uzbekistan basically, and one's getting it from Xinjiang. And like, they're just, these are neighbors, right? So yet they also share exactly the same burial traditions in the early stages using, you know, integrating these kinds of grains. So, you know, this is what had me thinking about this non-uniformity idea, is that, you know, all of these different institutional profiles, you know, or institutional prototypes are kind of jumbled. And when we think about something like the Andronovo as an idea, you know, and I had a wonderful tea with Elena Kuzmina in the early 2000s, sitting in her beautiful home in Moscow. And we talked about what she actually conceptualized. And in a lot of ways, the history of archaeology doesn't really do her justice, because the way she wrote about the Andronovo in the scope of her work and the way she thought about it in her own personal words were really different things. Like, she thought about it in the way that we're now beginning to understand it. She knew that. I mean, I say that with great respect for her. She knew how diversified it was. She knew how, all these, but she didn't have the benefits of all of the modern methodological archaeometry that we have. And so now that we're able to sort of parse it, tear it apart, we can say, that Sintashta, while it's, for example, right? I mean, I was shocked to see how many, there's 3 outlier groups at Sintashta. So you have a really cosmopolitan population out there, some of whom look like folks from Gonur. I mean, they have genetics like Gonur, and that's just on a genetic level, right? So when you come back to this question then of how are the mechanisms, your first question was, what are the mechanisms of acceptance? I think it's all the things that we do today to integrate ourselves are probably the things that they did, right? It's like you learn how to make pottery differently. And so someone teaches you, and it might be through getting married. It might be through, working for a family, or, contracting your work with a certain set of groups. And you might bring with you some cultural nuances that come from your own background. I hate to sort of, trivialize it and make it a melting pot or anything like that, but the steppe was very much a genetic framework for admixture. And if you think about things like hunting, even, I mean, I love that concept of hunting as a social activity. The first thing that most herdsmen do, at least with me, have done with me when I got to their villages and such, was mount up and go on a hunt. And these are communities who today have, ex-Soviet farms, and they don't need hunting to eat for sure, but it's a way of kind of integrating, at least as, from a male perspective, it was a way of integrating me into their community, getting me up to the mountains and seeing what I was made of, laughing at me when I fall off the horse, whatever the case may be. It was a social activity. And I think that these are not to be underestimated in their power. That participation and your acceptance of those new traditions is a way that you then move the needle ever so slightly in terms of institutional change. And so when we see these vastly distributed similarities, be it, burial styles, which I know are the most, in one of the cases, the definition of the Andronovo comes out of the shared burial styles that we have, and the ceramic potting, those are probably the mechanisms where people are exchanging. And in fact, some of the work of Paula Dumani, specifically on the ceramics at Dali, shows this agglomerative process. So for example, we have early Bronze Age paste recipes that she's been able to reconstruct that perpetuate all the way through to the early Iron Age, the core paste thing. But then as you move through time into late, early, middle, middle, late, and then final early Iron Age, you see new paste recipes being added on, but the old ones never disappear. And that's in spite of the fact, this gets to your second question, of genetic turnover. So at a site like Dali, the early Bronze Age genetic signature and the late Bronze Age, or the middle Bronze Age, late Bronze Age signature are really, really significantly different. There is definitely a population kind of changeover. However, the same location is being used, the same economic practices are roughly being practiced, with the exception of some new additional farming techniques. And there's definitely, it's not 100%, and you saw that in the article. But there's definitely a lot of continuity, and I think it happens in this very organic sort of educational way. And to get to your final question about, what is the break in the history and how are those histories conceptualized? Well, on the one hand, they're integrated, and the other hand, they can be quite violently separated. We have very, very well dated evidence for grave robbery, which is another article that Taylor Hermes and I are working on, where we look at the actual chronologies of grave robbing. And we can see not only that they break into the graves and take whatever they take, because we have remnant bits and pieces of necklaces that are no longer there. We have handles of bronze knives, just the handle is left over, but not the knife. Things like this, where they really just trashed the burial. The bones are scattered all over the place in terms of inside the cysts. But they also desecrated it by throwing animal skulls and other things into the like trash, basically. And they threw a goat head into one of the burials. So these are like explicit ways of, I think, desecrating the previous burials or breaking ancestry or doing whatever. And in other cases, in the Iron Age case of grave robbery, they were extremely meticulous about how they grave robbed, and they didn't destroy it. They were very, very careful. They might have even known who the individual was. So again, you have these kinds of really nuanced personal narratives about how people interact with their previous histories. And a lot of it has to do with, I think, maybe questions of genetics, or maybe questions of ethnicity or identity. I mean, it's hard to say directly, but we do know that there's changeover. We know that there's evidence for, at least at Dali, for a considerable break in burial sort of, I guess, sanctification. And finally, you know, at the same time, continuity in a lot of other things. And so I guess a good place to live is a good place to live, even if you don't like the people who lived there before you. That's the narrative of colonialism, I guess, for a long period of time. So, you know, again, not to cast the newcomers as colonialists, but definitely as people who are integrating in a very complex way and in multiple different vectors. And I think that that's another message here that I think is really, really important. I think Alicia's talked about, you know, mentions this as well, or let's say highlights this, is, you know, there's a lot of different directions to the ways in which these communities are moving. And we've been so conditioned by very, very unilinear, like massive arrows moving east to west or west to east. It just doesn't look that way. And to map it any other way, you know, no one likes a messy, ugly map with thousands of different arrows on it. But that's why I start with that ugly, messy map with tons of different arrows on it, because that's probably the greater reality to the population history.
All right, so we need more arrows on all of our maps. That's the first takeaway there.
Or none, maybe.
Or none, exactly. All right, well, thank you all so much. We have about 15 minutes left, so I see we have a couple of Q&A questions. And I'd also like to invite the speakers from this morning in, because I'm sure they have questions or comments as well. So while they're joining us, I'll go ahead and bring up the Q&A. One of them is, do we know, a horse question. Do we know the origin of horses? Are they from a particular group?
Well, I mean, so this is, that's $1 million question, I guess. The thing that's really nice is that probably more than any other domestic animal taxa, horses have gotten the attention of really high quality archaeogenomics, sort of ancient geneticists have been doing, especially Dr. Ludovic Orlando has just been doing some incredible things. And in the process of attempting to answer that question, sort of accumulating with each coming year a more detailed picture about what the population history of horses might have looked like in different parts of East and Central Asia. And while I'm not going to, in this forum, touch the bigger question about bow tie, et cetera, you know, that work seems to nicely show a major sort of dispersal of an early lineage of horses, you know, that comes out of the kind of maybe Black Sea, Caspian, often called the Pontic Steppes area. And the horses that we find buried at deer stones in Hiruksurs in Mongolia at 1200 BC are the most basal branch when you make a big phylogenetic tree of domestic horses that have been sequenced and understood. They're right there next to Sintashta, right, which comes from this kind of western steppe zone. And so it's clear that is the sort of wellspring from which the horses that you know, that we encounter, at least in northern and Northeast Asia, really connect back to that event.
Thank you. The next question we have is there any kind of fish in the diets of these groups that we're looking at?
That's an Alicia question.
Yeah. I think there's been a lot of discussion using stable isotopes to identify fish in the diets. And I think, you know, part of me just wants to say, like, if you're living by a lake or a river that has fish in it, you're probably eating fish, right? I mean, you're not, it may not be isotopically evident at all times because isotopes are not that fine grained that we can actually always identify every single component of your diet. And actually no one has analyzed fish very often, from these steppe regions. So if you're living on Lake Baikal, you're definitely eating fish. If you're living along some of these bigger rivers, you're definitely eating fish. I think there have been a couple of sites where it was very clear. I think, I want to say at like Chicha that they had some good evidence for fish in the diet. But I think generally, that's what my thinking always is, like, even if we're not identifying it, and even if we're not finding fish remains, because we don't generally find that often, because most people are not doing flotation. I think actually at some of the Sintashta sites that Brian Hinks worked at, when they did flotation, they did find fish remains. So we know even at Sintashta sites that they're eating fish from the local environment.
We have noticed, when we try to do sort of summarize some of the radiocarbon chronology for Mongolia, at least, dates that are taken from human bone in most areas sort of tend to be older than those that are taken from herbivore, which tends to be the more reliable indicator of the calendrical event. So with the idea being that, human remains may be sort of edged in the wrong direction from a 14C perspective because of freshwater reservoir effect. That's something that folks could probably do, could dive into a bit more and characterize in a better way.
I should say, for a side note, on northwestern China, one of the sites I work at is surrounded by a river on 3 sides, and we've done flotation on all of our excavations, and so far we found 1 tiny fish vertebra at the site. So I don't know if they were just throwing their fish remains over the edge of the cliff and back into the river, or what was going on, but very few fish there at least. Another question we have, when and where do wheeled vehicles appear?
I could say a few words about it, given that I've done a little bit of reading about it. The conventional wisdom, and this is sort of really based on the work of David Anthony as much as anybody else, is that, the earliest chariots, at least, are from roughly the late 3rd millennium. So Sintashta, Archaim kind of burial grounds. Of course, the Yamnaya populations had carts. There's evidence for 4-wheeled carts going all the way back to the late centuries of the 4th millennium BC. And so most people would sort of target those populations as sort of the earliest wheeled vehicles. That being said, if you look much further to the east and south, so sort of the areas of the Indus Valley, or even areas of further in that direction, there's also precedent in the Indus Valley civilization for carts, in this case, bullock carts and other things. So there actually is sort of there's a potential for multiple sources of wheeled vehicle origins that might have influenced the way in which, ultimately they get integrated. But the conventional wisdom is that you're looking basically at the Western steppe regions, North Caspian, I think, for sort of your origins of your wheeled vehicles. I'm not sure if the other members here have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, so this is something that gets left out all the time for whatever reason with horses, and everything Michael said is totally on point. But in fact, there's actually a pretty obvious and clear precedent for wheeled vehicle transport in donkeys and donkey onager hybrids, and potentially even onager. So onager is sometimes called the Kulan, sometimes called the Asian wild ass. That is firmly centered in the 3rd millennium BC, and perhaps even the earlier half of the 3rd millennium BC, across a pretty broad swath of Mesopotamia, the Levant. They're not chariots in the technological sense. We're talking about things that are related to, sorry, there's going to be a barking dog. I just got a delivery. These are things that are technologically adapted from a cattle cart. The wheeled wagon being certainly the oldest thing that we can trace back, maybe even quite far back, 4,000 or 5,000 BC, and being used primarily with cattle. But in fact, there's pretty solid evidence that for 1,000 years or more, right, before horse chariots came along, there were these kind of less sophisticated and equid-based wheeled transport, going from a four-wheeled sort of wagony thing all the way down to something that looked kind of like a mix between a chariot and a Segway, in terms of like some people sort of straddling some funny. I mean, it's pretty interesting, and yeah, people somehow that often gets left out of the horse discussion for whatever reason. So
there's a really nice write-up on a lot of this by Mark Knauer, and he traces those ones in Mesopotamia to the Indus through trade, through Indian Ocean trade. But again, yeah, the early ones, you know, are basically fourth millennium, mid fourth millennium.
All right, I'm looking forward to the paper on the earliest archaeological evidence for the Segway coming out soon. The last question we have from the audience is, I'm curious about extraction and trade in salt and or other non-metallurgical minerals.
Sorry, mute.
Was Brian going to answer that?
Feedback from scholars in the same room. There's no direct evidence, and I know, you know, one of my friends and colleagues, Rowan, Vlad, and the rest of them working on salt in China, they've always asked me the question, and there must have been something. There's, even nowadays, when you travel across from the Khangai Mountains in central Mongolia toward the Altai Mountains and get into what, even during the Xiongnu Han times, was called the Great Lakes region. There are plenty of tiny little salt ponds and areas that people are harvesting for salt with very limited technology. You know, just these scoops that go out because the salt rises up to these little salt ponds, and it's almost like going up to a crème brûlée and just taking off the salt from the top. So unfortunately, we wouldn't get all that nice briquetage, like the kinds of things that Rowan and others are looking at. So it's hard to say, like, there wouldn't be any remnant technologies or pottery for processing that. But that said, when the Han Chinese push up into the northern stretches of the Ordos area, that upper bend of the Yellow River, when they push up into those areas, they're establishing salt offices. And even when you look nowadays in China, some of the best salt resources, natural salt resources, are in that upper bend of the Yellow River. And when you look at some of the later periods where they have better texts, there are actually documents from the Manchu period where local Mongolian groups and local Chinese groups are fighting over control of these salt resources. And they, you know, write letters to the government saying, you know, this is not going very well. So unfortunately, we don't have any evidence from this sort of like Xiongnu or earlier periods, but there definitely must have been something if the Han Chinese were establishing these big salt processing and you know, collection and distribution offices up in the upper bend of the Yellow River.
There's also a site in northwest Mongolia. It's not really published in the English literature, but there's a salt mine that dates to the early Middle Ages where a bunch of wooden mining tools and stuff were sort of found in one of the salt mining areas of northwest Mongolia.
Yeah, and of course Lake Ofs with all that huge salt. So there must have been, but yeah, it'd be nice to get more.
Outside of the realm of salt, you know, there's a really elaborate set of studies, again, by Mark Knauer and some of his former students, guys like Randy Law, looking at southern mountain regions. So, you know, we've been thinking very much about the northern steppe and northern parts of Eurasia, but if you get further down into the mountains of the Hindu Kush and Pamir, there's a lot of research that goes into the study of semi-precious stones, things like lapis, carnelian, you know, et cetera, both being traded to Mesopotamia vis-a-vis, you know, overland and overseas trade, but then again, up into Eurasia as well. And so, you know, when you think about the kinds of stones and resources that are, again, you know, coming back to Will's point about the advantages of mountains are a treasure trove. You know, they're full of really beautiful stuff, whether it be metal ores or even precious stones. And if you think about some of the communities that we've been discussing, like the BMAC, they integrate a lot of these semi-precious stones into their artifacts. And those items are not coming from the steppe or necessarily even from the deserts. They're coming from the mountains. And that trade goes back at least to the mid fourth millennium. And so I encourage you to take a look at some of the work that Randy Law has done on, if you're interested in semi-precious stones and that kind of thing in the southern reaches of, what I call the IMAC, but basically the Inner-Asian Mountains, you'll find some really, really cool histories there.
All right, we have one last question that I think we can squeeze in that just came in. It says, is there enough of a zooarchaeological basis to say something about differential integration and importance of domestic dogs in the various models of pastoral, agropastoral, and foraging subsistence touched on here?
We always have dogs in any of the samples that we've done with Archaeofauna have always had a small number of dogs, but a lot of times you don't see them in the domestic context. So oftentimes it's a preservation issue, or let's say a depositional issue.
The record is pretty thin from Mongolia. In fact, some of the only ones that jump out to me date to the Afanasevo period. I think it's, again, probably one of these situations where cultural practice has left us empty-handed in a way that, obviously dogs have a really crucial role to play in pastoral history. And sometimes, if you take a look at like rock art or whatever, you can get these clues, which, sort of tantalize people. I think there's a ton that's just missing from our perspective on the basis of what's trickled down to us archaeologically. If you look at people that work with modern dogs from a genomics perspective or whatever, it's clear that Central Asia has an absolutely essential role to play in the human dog story and whatever. So that's something that hopefully, will be filled in over time.
I think that there were, a bunch of dogs identified at Kent, which is sort of this this urbanized locale. So that's kind of interesting because, we always talk about, dogs and pastoralism being associated, but this is sort of in a period when, people are pastoralists, but, what would the use be in this sort of proto-urban center and how that would be used? So that's sort of an interesting discussion. I don't know if any of those have been properly analyzed. I think Ashley Haruda would be the person to ask about that. Yeah, and we also found
also listening. I can see she's here.
Yeah, we also found a very cool cat at the medieval site of John Kent. So forget dogs, cats are where it's at.
Well, on that note, I wish we could go on a bit longer. And of course, under normal circumstances, we would linger at the venue and then we'd head to dinner to continue talking over wine and food. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this very stimulating event. So on behalf of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, I want to thank all the speakers for joining us and providing us with a glimpse into their fascinating research projects. I want to thank the chairs/discussants for being so effective in tying the presentations together and also for your very thoughtful comments. I do want to thank Skye van Valkenburg for overseeing the webinar and her clear communications with participants, and to Frank BA for managing the logistics of the conference. And finally, so many thanks to the audience who joined us today. We really hope that you enjoyed the papers and the stimulating discussions. The recording will be posted on our website as soon as the editor completes the final version. It should take no more than a week or so. And then the spring program will be uploaded onto the website in the next few weeks. And we look forward to seeing you there, at least virtually. So until then, our warm wishes for what remains of the holiday season. And for the panelists, please check your email for the debriefing link. So thank you all very much.